Now, the Science and Technology Committee undertook an inquiry into this new funding agency, and we issued a report on the 12th of February. The bill to bring into existence what will be known as ARIA, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, backed by £800 million of taxpayers' money, was published 2 weeks ago and is about to begin its scrutiny in both Houses of Parliament. The Prime Minister's previous chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, is, through his writings, widely thought to be the originator of the ARPA model as a proposal for the UK, and indeed is known to be a supporter of the commitment to increase the science budget. Now he's no longer working for the government, he's free to speak, and we're very grateful for his attendance today. I'm also delighted to anticipate the attendance of the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the new Secretary of State, and his lead official on science policy in what will be their first appearance before this committee. Now, this is a session on science funding. The committee has also been inquiring into the COVID pandemic. And there are questions that we would like to ask Mr. Cummings about the response to the pandemic. He's kindly agreed to give evidence on that to the joint inquiry that we're holding with the Health and Social Care Select Committee on lessons learned from the pandemic. And so that will allow us to focus today's session on science funding. Perhaps I can start with a question to Mr. Cummings. What is the problem to which ARIA is the solution?
So I think there's a few overall problems. First of all, almost all science funders globally operate in the same way. They have pretty much the same metrics like papers. They have pretty much the same kind of horrific bureaucracy. They waste huge amounts of time for the researchers in filling out all of these forms, and they get pretty much the same results. Secondly, you have a few examples historically of things that work on completely different principles and are super productive. But these sort of entities, whether it's like the Manhattan Project, like the old LMB, like ARPA in the 60s, Bletchley, these sort of things they tend to be destroyed by bureaucracies pretty quickly over time, and the people who run them tend to be driven away. It's turned out to be extremely hard for normal government systems to learn from the most productive enterprises. You also have a situation in which issues around science and technology are increasingly important to government. We've obviously just seen that in 2020 with COVID. And you also have this huge wall of money from people like from China and from America coming into it. So you have all of these different pressures on the system, and you have a Whitehall which is not being configured to think rationally about how to do science and technology policy. Britain can't solve all of these problems by itself, and an agency can't. So I think, obviously, there's a whole bunch of things that have to change in the overall system. What ARIA can do, though, is to be decisively different from all other funding entities. So I've got a chart done by a brilliant scientist who wrote the textbook on quantum computers, a guy called Michael Nielsen. Hopefully you can see this. I'll put it on my blog if it doesn't show up very well. But
we'll put it on the committee's website as well.
This is basically where all funders globally are. They're in this little bubble here. But this is the actual design space for how you could do science and technology. And the purpose of ARIA ought to be to sample in this broader design space, to do things differently, to learn from the things that have been super productive in the past. And that essentially means, in very simple terms, it means extreme freedom. That's one of the great lessons of the things that have been most successful historically. That's what produced the internet and the personal computing revolution. You need to strip out all of the horrific Whitehall bureaucracy around procurement, state aid, human resources, civil service pay scales, all of these sorts of things, and a huge set of processes from the Treasury as well, things like the Treasury business case process, which is horrific and causes huge delays in science and technology. There's logic for it elsewhere in the system, but as applied to science and technology, it's very damaging. So I think, in a nutshell, the way I would define the purpose of ARIA is there's no point creating it if it's just going to be another entity in that little red thing. Right? The purpose of it has to be to sample the wider space and to do things very differently.
And to do that with extreme freedom and busting the bureaucracy that's already there.
Yes.
We'll come and ask some more detailed questions about each part of that, and my colleagues have got some follow-up questions. I think it's evident, most people accept that the proposal to have a UK ARPA, now ARIA, was yours. Was it something that you proposed to the Prime Minister? Was it part of a deal that you did with the Prime Minister to join him?
So I wouldn't say it's my idea. I mean, all I'm doing was suggesting what a lot of the best scientists and technology people in the world have been suggesting for decades, actually, that Britain should learn from some of these examples, including the 60s ARPA. So I wouldn't, in any way, this is not my idea. Essentially what happened in terms of what you're talking about is the Prime Minister came to speak to me the Sunday before he became Prime Minister and said, would I come into Downing Street to try and help sort out the huge Brexit nightmare. I said, yes, if, first of all, you're deadly serious about actually getting Brexit done and avoiding a second referendum. Secondly, double the science budget. Third, create some ARPA-like entity. And fourth, support me in trying to change how Whitehall works and the Cabinet Office work, because it's a disaster zone. And he said, deal.
Where did he say deal? Where were you when that was concluded?
In my living room the Sunday before he became Prime Minister.
Just you and him, or were there others there?
Just him, just me and him.
Okay. And now that you're not there, are you confident that the government will stick to the four elements of that? One has clearly been done already.
I think that, as far as I can see from the budget, the plan is to stick to the doubling of the science budget, though there are some issues around that. I think that the fact that they brought in the bill shows that the government remains committed to doing it. I think the problem is much less likely to be, does the government decide not to bother trying to do an ARPA? The problem is this deeper problem, that it's just, there's a reason why it's, on the one hand you think, okay, you've got this model from the 1960s. It's so incredibly fruitful that a few $100 million generates tens of trillions of dollars in value with the internet and the personal computer revolution and all the other things that were spun off out of park. Obviously, human civilization will learn from that and try and do the same thing, right? But in fact, it turns out that's that's the opposite of the truth. In fact, what happens is ARPA itself, the institution that did that, was itself very much changed in 1975. It became more bureaucratized, made it much harder to fund things like the internet. So I think that's the real problem here for ARIA. It's not so much will the government lose the will to do it, it's that the principles according to which these sorts of things are very successful are completely hostile to normal bureaucracies. That's why they don't normally happen. And therefore I think the bigger danger is that it sort of half happens, that they create something but it's basically no different. And if MPs were going to choose to do that, then it would actually be better, in my opinion, not to bother doing it at all. The only point of doing it is to make it decisively different from what already exists. Otherwise, you're just adding to the chaos.
Okay, we'll come into some aspects of that. But isn't there a paradox here about ARPA ARIA? It was in the Queen's speech in October 2019. We're now in March 2021, nearly a year and a half later. It hasn't even begun its passage through Parliament yet.
Yeah.
You've just been very critical of the bureaucracy surrounding administration and science funding. Yet this institution seems to have the gestation periods of an elephant. You were in office for 80% of this time. You were, after the Prime Minister, the most powerful person in Downing Street, and some say the country. Why were you not able to make it happen during that time?
So we made some progress in the second half of 2019 on it, but we were inevitably, fundamentally, like everyone else in politics, we were swamped by the Brexit problem. As soon as the election was finished, I started work on this in January. Actually, science funding was the main thing that I worked on in January, immediately after the election. But of course, then, like everything else in government, everything was kind of swept away for a few months in the first wave of COVID. But I think the fact, so you're obviously right to point to the delays, but I think that show, so having had many dozens and dozens of meetings on this, it's connected to the problem I mentioned in the previous sentence. Doing something like this is so contrary to how the normal system works that it's very hard in Whitehall to push through something like this. You have, after over a year of discussing it, we suddenly had the Treasury come back in September, October time last year and say, hang on a second, we don't want to have primary legislation at all. My God, if we do this and we start enshrining in legislation that some entities don't have to follow all of our bureaucracy, my God, where will it end? Everyone will suddenly want to have this wonderful freedom. Maybe we can do this without having any bill.
But it was in the Queen's speech in October 2019. Why were you debating whether legislation would be needed when it was included in the Queen's speech 18 months earlier?
Because the Treasury suddenly came back and said, we've come up with our own different legal advice after a year of everyone in Whitehall debating it, and we actually think that we don't need a bill after all, and this is a completely different way of doing it. So I think the whole episode shows just how hard it is for Whitehall to deal with the concept of creating something with low friction and removing things like the Treasury business case.
Final one from me on this before I turn to colleagues. In our report, we said that £800 million for a new science funding institution is obviously very welcome, as long as that is not taken from raiding very important existing science budgets and projects. Was part of your deal with the Prime Minister that this should be additional, or did you anticipate that this would come out of other research programs, including medical research that has served us so well during this pandemic?
No, it was always very, very explicit and clear throughout my time in government that this would be additional money. We made those commitments to the Royal Society, to all the different funding councils, to everybody else. This should all be part of should be funded with new money from the doubling. That was always the original plan. That was the plan throughout my time in government. Hopefully that hasn't changed. If it has, then it shouldn't have done.
And so you wouldn't expect that the budgets for UKRI, for example, should be falling given this?
Certainly not. And so when I left, the UKRI budget was penciled in the spending review to get very generous increases over coming years, as it should do.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to my colleagues, starting with Graham Stringer.
Morning, Dominic, and thanks for coming to the committee. Are you pleased with the detail in the bill that will set up this organisation? Because when I read it, it looked as though the bureaucrats who you say destroy initiative and innovation in the science world had got their grubby mitts on it, because at any time the government can take control of the organisation. If you look at Schedule 1 in the bill, there are all sorts of other controls in Section 2 of the bill. Are you pleased with it or disappointed with it?
There are too many restrictions. Certainly in my model of it, you wouldn't have ministers anywhere near making decisions about how it spends money. I think that would be a disaster. In my model, it would be extremely simple. You would find a director. You'd have probably maximum 4 trustees, so that they are actually real trustees and they have real control, not one of these normal government things with like 20 people on a board, so that no one's actually exercising serious responsibility for it. And you would cut it loose of the rest of the system. So no, I'm not confident about how it will work out. There's certainly very strong. So there's a mix, as you would expect. On the one hand, there's a lot of people who know the history of things like ARPA and Bell Labs and the old LMB and whatnot, who know the value of this kind of model and say, obviously, Britain should do this. And there are a lot of brilliant officials who think it's a wonderful idea and they've worked extremely hard to do it. But it's also crucial to remember that the basic principle of extreme freedom is completely hostile, is completely the opposite of how all normal science funding works and how all normal Whitehall works. So I think UMPs have to be extremely vigilant. In particular, I think vigilant about. Look, I think there's a tendency to think of the science funding system like there's people running the system, but that's not the reality. The reality is the system runs the people. There's huge veto points everywhere, so everyone can block things, everyone can stop good things happening, but almost nobody can actually get anything done. And this chain of bureaucracy runs all the way down from the people at the bottom of the hierarchy in things like EPSRC making decisions about pure maths, through the hierarchy of the EPSRC, through UKRI, through BEIS, and then up to the Treasury. So you have these chains of business cases and emails running up and down this hierarchy for month after month after month, driving everybody completely insane. But if you say, well, let's just completely get rid of that, it makes no sense. Then some parts of the system say brilliant, and other parts of the system say, oh my God, we can't possibly do that.
Right.
It seems to me that as the draft bill is at the moment, there is less freedom for scientific innovation and new ideas than you would get in a university department, and there is more control. There is no overall mission statement. One of the strengths of DARPA, when it was set up, was that there was an overall mission statement, which was to make the United States of America a safer place. Do you think it's a mistake not to have an overall mission statement? And just incidentally, in terms of the detailed objectives in sort of 26A, B and C in the bill, it says look at the economy, innovation, improving quality of life, but there's nothing about defence there. Is that a mistake?
So I think, as you say, if you look at the original mission statement for the old ARPA in 1958, it was to prevent strategic surprise in science and technology. Not the exact words, but something like to prevent strategic surprise in science and technology for the United States. My version of it for here would be, as I said, to accelerate scientific discovery far beyond what's currently normal, and to seek strategic advantage in some fields of science and technology for the United Kingdom. That's how I would define it. And I would keep it broad and vague like that. I would also point out that if you talk to the old-timers who are actually involved with ARPA and saw the transition to DARPA in 1975, they think that that was a retrograde step. And in fact, DARPA, after 75, had to come up with all kinds of bureaucratic wheezes in order to try and fund things like the internet in the future. So I wouldn't give it a specific defence focus. I certainly wouldn't try and import a bunch of buzzwords like AI and quantum and net zero and things like that. I just think it doesn't add anything. I would stick to a broad mission statement as I've described, sampling this broader design space for science and technology, and achieving strategic advantage for Britain in some fields. That's how I would define it.
My final question, I don't know if you're familiar with the Howard Hughes Research Centre just outside Washington, DC, which has some of the best scientists in the world looking at the brain and how it functions, trying to make breakthroughs. It seems to me, and I'd be interested in your comments, that you are promoting something more like that Howard Hughes Centre on the brain, rather than a UK DARPA.
So yes, I am familiar with that. I actually visited the Genelia farm where that institution is, and actually I brought over a brilliant young British neuroscientist who was working there, and he now works in Number 10, and he made some critical contributions to how the British government dealt with COVID last year. I don't think that what I'm proposing is not to have something which is narrowly focused like that on one area. So I wouldn't just say aim at neuroscience or whatever. I would leave those sort of decisions to the institution. To ARIA itself. I would leave it as a very broad science and technology thing. Not least because, to begin with, the people that are running it one of the crucial lessons for ARPA in the 60s and 70s was giving people space for problem finding, not just sending them off saying solve this problem straight away. Problem finding is as important, sometimes more important than solving the problem. So I think when we create this thing, the people who are running it need space and time to go out and talk to people out on the ground and figure out what are these ideas. So by definition, things like creating the internet in the 60s are not obvious. They're not on the front pages of the newspapers. They're not all being talked about in scientific conferences now. They're not on the front page of Science and Nature by definition. So it'll take time to go and find these ideas and find these often very odd people who are pursuing them.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll go to Catherine Fletcher now.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Dominic, for offering to come and talk to us today. What you're describing is almost like a skunkworks model, if I put it in my language, which is a bunch of incredibly bright people kind of working in the same space and feeding off each other. What do you actually want them to do? You keep saying go and sample, but are we sampling in highly theoretical aspects like, I don't know, aligning quantum mechanics and special relativity? Are you sampling in achieving long-term goals like carbon attenuation, or are you just boiling the ocean with 800 million quid and hoping for the best?
So I think it does definitely have some similarities with the famous skunk works in terms of the kind of the culture of the organisation, looking for very extreme talent and having a very extreme antipathy for bureaucracy are obviously two of the key elements of skunk works. But I think it's not. I've sort of deliberately avoided giving my views from. I don't think views from me on what sort of thing it should be looking at honestly have any real value. It should be going off to people really out on the far edges of the science world and talking to them about what's really valuable. If you look back at what happened in the early 60s, it was this guy Licklider who said, actually computing could be done completely differently. I've got a vision for how we can have personal, interactive, dynamic computing with everyone universally networked worldwide. And he wrote a famous memo about the intergalactic communications network. Those things they're hidden. They're not. It's not for me to come out and start giving my theories about what they should be. You need to find people who can go off and talk to these people out there, and in particular searching for young people who now struggle to get funding.
So I was going to come on to that. So I've been really personally struck by the amount of young, bright researchers that are frustrated with the bureaucracy, not least women who can't plan a family because their funding settlements only run for the next 12 months. But what I'm bothered about is the fallibility of human beings in this system. So if you've got like a tiny leadership team of a director and 4 trustees, you're effectively looking for like 5 Sir Patrick Valences or Hooks or Boyles or Newtons. How are you going to stop a small number of people getting the wool pulled over their eyes by the tinfoil hat brigade that come along and say, if you give me 100 million quid, I'm going to, stop aliens from being able to read our minds? How do you have in the leadership the technical understanding to not get the money spent badly?
Well, so on your first point, I think the youth thing is a critical problem. I'll give you a concrete example of that. One of the most influential physicists in Britain in the last 50 years is David Deutsch at Oxford, who wrote the famous papers around 1980-1981 about quantum computers, which helped start the whole field going. If you ask him, he recently went back to the people who actually funded him and said, what would happen if I came to you with my 1980 idea now? And they all said, well, there's obviously no way on earth you'd ever get funded now. So I think that sums up the problem you're talking about, that it's very hard now for young people to get funding for ideas which are far from the normal. Now everyone babbles on about quantum computers. It's become a buzzword.
That's cool. But how do you stop the tinfoil hat brigade pulling the wool over 5 people's eyes with a lot of money?
Well, you've got to pick the 5 people very carefully, But then those five, so the ARPA model is that you have a very, very flat organizational structure. You have a director in charge of it. And then they have good taste in finding people. And there's no alternative to this fundamental problem. You have to have someone in charge who has good taste in scientific ideas and in scientific researchers. That's how all of these institutions worked. It's how General Groves operated the Manhattan Project. It's how Rowena found Licklider in the first place. It's how Licklider found Robert Taylor. It's how Robert Taylor created Xerox PARC in the 1970s. There is no alternative ever discovered on Earth to having funders with great taste in ideas and people.
I gently point out that all the people that you've just mentioned are blokes, and taste is one of those subjective human things that we need to be careful and worry about when concentrating great power in a small number of hands. But let me shift on to some of the evidence that we've heard from people previously. It was all about culture and leadership and creating brains sparking off each other in interdisciplinary areas, rather than giving an individual maverick the funding to go and produce that. To what extent, in your view of ARIA, is that where's that collaboration and where's that temporary nature that I thought was very powerful evidence?
So I think this is a very important point. Academia and universities now, one of the things that they're terrible at, and one of the things that the current system is terrible at, is funding teams to do certain things. The system now is extremely focused on individual researchers writing papers. It's terrible at funding teams where the output is not a paper, it's software or it's a tool or something like that. So, for example, one example which everyone in this committee will be familiar with is DeepMind. Demis Hassabis had to go to California and talk to people like Peter Thiel to get cash to get DeepMind going, because the British funding system just does not think naturally in that way. And that's exactly one of the things I think that ARIA should be able to do. It should be able to say, okay, here is a Licklider type person. They've got a vision of how they can build this thing over the next 10 years. They need 50 million quid a year for, say, 10 years. Right, there you go, knock yourselves out. That's exactly the sort of thing that it should be doing. But I don't think it should be limited to that. So I think a crucial distinction is, that often is lost in this ARPA-DARPA thing, is now DARPA is very much focused on what's referred to as missions and moonshots and things like that, where you have a specific goal and a specific deadline. So the 1960s Apollo, put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. That's a great model, and that can bring fantastic progress for civilization. But it's not the only way of doing things, and ARIA should not be limited to that. And I would point out that the Licklider vision for personal computing and interactive computing in the internet was not such a moonshot. It was a much more kind of ephemeral thing, and much more powerful for it being that. It actually drove decades of research and discovery, and was so rich that you still have people now, 50 years later in Silicon Valley, people like Brett Victor, setting up new labs saying people have missed this idea from 50 years ago. So I think ARIA should have that kind of freedom to do both things. It should be able to find the Lickliders, but it should also be able to fund specific moonshots if it wants to.
I'm with you. I mean, I could spend ages debating scientific nerdery with you. I'm very conscious that we've got a public audience who will be funding this ultimately. So, final question, Chair.
We'll come back, Catherine, if we may. We need to go to Dawn, but I'll bring you in a bit later. Dawn?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Dominic, for coming to the committee.
Pleasure.
And Dominic, you spoke earlier about finding scientists from America, bringing them over to work in Number 10. I know you would have thought about this quite intently. Who do you think should be in charge of, and who do you think should lead ARIA, and why?
So I think that the sort of person, I'll give you three people just as the sort of people who I would think of. There's a guy called Michael Nielsen. He wrote the textbook on quantum computers. I think it's one of the top 10 cited physics books ever or something. But he's also spent the last 10 years really thinking, living in San Francisco, really thinking about how science itself works. He wrote a brilliant book called Reinventing Discovery. He would be a perfect person because he's actually done brilliant science, he knows these people, but he's also, unusually for scientists, actually studied the process and the history of funding and written a book about it. And he's seen this kind of intersection in the worlds of science, technology, venture capital, project management, etc., in Palo Alto and places. So someone like that, I think, would be a great example. Steve Su, the physicist, who's also worked in genomics and other things, and also from the startup world. Again, he's got a mix of different backgrounds. In Britain, there's a brilliant mathematician who won the Fields Medal called Tim Gowers. Tim, I think, has exactly the right kind of mindset and character, and would be a wonderful person to have either running this or to be chairman of it if he wouldn't run it. There's a brilliant physicist called Chiara, who's one of David Deutsch's students. She's a classic example of a young female scientist who's struggling for funding now, but has brilliant ideas. Those are the sort of people that need to be involved in this kind of entity, I would say.
Thank you, Tom.
Great, thank you. So obviously these are the people that you know, and you talked about having scientists on the edge, the wild cards and the misfits, the people that you really like. So this is going to be your legacy, okay? How will you stay involved?
Oh, I won't be involved. I'm not seeking to be involved. I wouldn't want to be involved. I shouldn't be involved.
Why shouldn't you be involved?
Well, the only way in which I could add any value to it would be if you picked the wrong people in the first place. I mean, if you pick the right people, then what could I possibly contribute to it?
Great. So if you were offered a position, you wouldn't take it?
No, I know that there are some rumours around about that sort of thing, and rumours that Number 10 has asked me to do it or whatever. But I don't know if they are thinking about that. But if it was suggested, I would certainly say no.
Thank you. Do you consider eugenics to be a science, and do you think it needs more research?
I don't really know what you mean by eugenics. There's obviously a huge amount of work now going on in genomics, in understanding how the genome works, and there's a huge amount of work happening in genetic engineering and in technologies like CRISPR, which have both huge promise and also huge potential disasters. I certainly think that one of Britain's great scientific advantages is our leadership in this field, in genomics, genetic engineering, things like that. That advantage has proved extremely valuable in COVID, because I think we've been one of, if not possibly even the leading scientific country in sequencing different variants of COVID. So I strongly think that fundamental science research should be funded here.
Thank you. Why isn't ARIA a division of UKRI? Did you not see that in your kind of brainchild idea when you was putting it all together, that it will be, even if it's a sub-arm, remote arm of UKRI?
No, I think it definitely should not be part of UKRI, and Ottoline Laser, the director of UKRI, agrees with me. UKRI is a young organisation. It's done some excellent things, but it also suffers from this very extreme bureaucracy problem. I had to spend a lot of time last spring, for example, dealing with blockages in the funding system to therapeutics that were necessary for dealing with COVID, and there were lots of blockages in the system. Then it's one of the many reasons why we chose to do the vaccine program the way that we did. So I think if you're going to put it inside UKRI, then don't do it at all. It would be my advice. As I said before, the only justification for doing this is if you do it outside of the existing system and outside of the existing processes. If you're going to just put it inside UKRI, then all you're doing is adding to the bureaucracy, and everyone will be far better off just to give UKRI the money and not bother creating it. And I'd just stress that Ottoline, having been there, agrees with this.
Okay, thank you. And my last question, so you said in January this was your main thing that you worked on, the science, ARIA. Is that the reason why you were given the £45,000 pay rise?
No. So the media reports about me getting a pay rise after COVID are wrong. It is true that I interfered with the pay system regarding my own pay, but that was in summer 2019. When I arrived, I was put on the normal pay band for my position of 140-something thousand. I said that I didn't want that, and I only wanted to be paid what I was paid at Vote Leave. I figured that I should be paid the same for trying to sort out the Brexit mess as I've been paid for doing Vote Leave. So I asked for a pay cut, which is what happened in summer 2019. For some reason, this has appeared in the media as if I got a pay rise after COVID, but that didn't happen. When we were all rehired in the day after the election, then I moved back onto the normal pay grade for my position.
Oh, that's interesting.
Thank
Thank
you
you for clearing that up. Thank you very much, Dominic.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dominic, for coming in today. I must say I agree with what you were saying with Graham earlier about the risk about bureaucracies. It strikes me a lot of the examples you gave about how this has worked well in the past, the Manhattan Project, DARPA itself, they stem from an existential sense of crisis, whether the Second World War or the Cold War. A couple of years ago, the government looked at the grand challenges of AI and data, ageing society, clean growth, future of mobility. Those are all challenges, but I don't think they ever felt a sense of existential crisis. And we've just been through an existential crisis, which has seen huge innovations, particularly with mRNA vaccines.
Yeah.
Without a crisis, will ARIA really work?
That is a very good question. I mean, you're right, historically, these things do tend to be created, and particularly only to be given extreme freedom when you do face some kind of existential crisis. I hope that the disaster of last year, in a rational world, it ought to make the case for ARIA just completely open and closed. Remember, in February, March, April last year, there was no entity in the British state, 0 entities, including the Prime Minister himself, who could make rapid decisions on science funding minus horrific EU procurement, state aid, etc. laws. No entity in the British state that could operate at scale and at pace. And that was obviously disastrous. And it seems to me that one of the most obvious lessons of last year is that A, we should go to extreme lengths to try and de-bureaucratise the normal system. But secondly, you have to accept that there's always going to be, certain sets of rules for certain sorts of things. You need to have an emergency process where an entity of the state can actually move at speed and scale to do all sorts of things, buying, a procurement and whatnot. But I think it also makes the case for creating an institution like ARIA. I think the other thing, I mean, an obvious thing, so I've deliberately tried to not get into sort of my own ideas for what sort of things it would fund, but it seems to me obvious that one of the things that should be funded now is a combination of mass distributed testing at home, mass distributed genetic sequencing, mRNA vaccines, and the supply chains to scale them up. If you look at a guy who's recently ran the US biosecurity program, so he's responsible for trying to deal with, is North Korea trying to develop smallpox and stuff like that.
Sure.
He said recently, there's actually a roadmap. If you talk to the top scientists in the world, people like George Church, there's a roadmap for how, over the next 5-10 years, you could actually build this infrastructure to deal with pandemics so that we don't have the kind of disaster that we saw last year. That's the sort of thing that I think should be the impetus for creating an entity like this.
Does that not make a case for potentially making the Department of Health or the NHS itself the client for ARIA in the same way that the Department of Defence was for DARPA?
No, I don't think so. I think that there is certainly a case for the Department for Health. I think all government departments both have to take science and technology far more seriously than they have done so far, and have better funding for it in their normal provision. And they should also all have a small little pot of maybe 5% of the budget that goes to funding people who are thinking very long term and are on the edge. So I think that there's an argument for lots of for Department for Health, for example, having an entity that could do that. Obviously, last year, we saw the Department for Health had just absolute total disaster in terms of buying, how it buys, how it procures, how it deals with science and technology. It's why we had to take the vaccine process out of the Department for Health. Yeah. But I don't think that means. I don't think that leads you to the conclusion that you make the Department for Health the client for ARIA. I think ARIA should be broadly defined. It should be able to look at challenges and problems across the whole domain of science and technology.
So you've made clear the leadership is vital to ARIA. If we get the wrong leadership, is your expectation that it will just end up becoming another arm of what we've got at the moment? And you've said that's undesirable, you might as well not do it at all.
Yes, I think that the strongest argument really against this whole concept is it was interesting when I was talking to some of the old timers who are actually part of the original thing, so who were funded by Licklider and Robert Taylor themselves. And they said, these are people who've won Turing medals and God knows what. And they said, one of the weird things about this world is that it seems like great funders are much rarer than Nobel Prize winners and Turing medal winners.
Yeah.
And it certainly does seem that people like General Groves and George Muller, who did the Apollo program, and Bob Taylor, are very, very odd people. And I think that is the chief bottleneck in this kind of thing, and the most obvious way in which it will fail. If you just get some bog standard vice chancellor and put them in, then obviously it won't work.
Can I just squeeze one more in my time on? You wanted weirdos and misfits with odd skills into the civil service. Clearly, ARIA is designed to encourage those people in the science sphere. Without going into what happened with the civil service, do you think if ARIA works, there will be lessons to read across from it to other aspects of the state, including Whitehall?
Yes, unquestionably. Unquestionably, I think 2020 was a proof that if you don't have people who with scientific and technical backgrounds who understand how to think rationally and quantitatively about extreme uncertainty, then you can very easily have disastrous decisions. Bringing people who do have those skills into that decision-making process helps you avoid disasters. And I'm sure that if you create ARIA in the right way, then it will have a very, very positive effect for British science in general. And it's interesting how much support there is for it globally, right? Lots of these people have read the old books. They know what happened in Los Alamos with General Groves. Yeah. They know what happened with a lot of them with Licklider in the 60s. Everyone can see the personal computer internet revolution staring them in the face. And scientists themselves know how horrific the current system is, and particularly how terrible it is for young people. I would just keep stressing that. It's terrible for young people. Mm-hmm. And the strongest supporters that I've found of this are not necessarily the very high status people who already control powerful labs and have huge amounts of money. For lots of them, the system works fine as it is. But that's not good for British science. It's not good for the world. What we really need, if you had Newton or Darwin or Turing turning up now with their ideas aged 20, 21, everyone in the current system would say, well, are you mad? Of course we're not funding you.
Thank you.
So we've got to have a system that's open to people like that.
We want to come on to some broader questions of science funding, and that's a useful introduction to that. But I want to take a quick question from Carol, who'll have a question later on as well, and I said I'd come back to Catherine. Carol.
Thanks very much, Chair. And maybe just point out that Newton and Einstein's ideas were sneered at whenever they first presented them. However, Dominic, you've talked this morning about the extreme freedom. to go ahead and explore ideas. Now, the events of the last year and the pandemic have taught us that there must be checks and balances where public money is concerned to ensure that cronyism is not the overriding decision maker. So how do we avoid extreme freedom leading to extreme cronyism when we're looking at funding?
I slightly missed the very beginning of that, but I think your question is, does extreme freedom mean extreme cronyism? Is that right?
Yes,
in simple
how
terms.
do we avoid, if we're talking about spending public money, how do we ensure that the extreme freedom doesn't mean it's been spent without checks and balances and that it is going to those and such as those who have the connections?
So I think that looks at the problems the wrong way around. So we've got a procurement system that was created by the EU framework and then gold-plated by Whitehall. I and others said repeatedly before 2020, this system is an expensive disaster zone, and when it hits a crisis, it will completely fall over. So that system hit a crisis and it completely fell over. But this is a system which is, the justification for it supposedly was, well, we've got all of these processes and that means that everyone, yes, it might be a bit slow, but we can be sure that, it's all very proper and whatnot. Learning the lesson from, okay, we've got an extremely bureaucratic system that can't cope with a crisis, let's make it more bureaucratic and have more process, I think is the exact opposite lesson that I would learn. If you go back and look at the history, say, of Manhattan Project, one of the interesting things was that when Congress looked at all of the accounts for it afterwards, after the war, not only was everyone completely gobsmacked by how productive and what an amazing achievement it was, but they were also completely gobsmacked by the fact that General Groves basically ran around the country handing out something like 2% of US GDP, often with only a handshake, with absolutely no lawyers involved, no processes at all. And Congress was astonished to see that not only how super productive that was, but also how completely free of cronyism and corruption and everything else. Now, what happened in the 60s was that the Pentagon kind of went in the opposite direction. They brought in these hugely laborious procurement processes, and that's what actually created this nightmare of corruption and cronyism in the whole US defense industry, from which it's extremely hard to escape. So again, if you look at the people who actually did these kind of...
Can I interrupt you slightly?
What, sorry?
Can I bring you in a bit?
When you're talking about the Manhattan Project, you're talking about a project that had a specific target. You're not talking about a body with a specific target, so it's quite a different entity that we're discussing today.
Well,
just briefly on that, and then I'll bring Carol in a bit later.
So with respect, I don't think that's quite... So you're right, Manhattan Project did have a specific target of creating a nuclear device before Hitler. But exactly the same argument that I'm making applies to Licklider and ARPA in the early 60s. That did not have a specific... It was not a mission. It was not an Apollo-type mission. It was a one-sentence vision statement from Licklider about interactive personal computing and networking everybody globally. So that and Park and the old LMB at Cambridge, that shows that you can have extremely low friction scientific funding, which is super productive and has no taint, or has much less cronyism and much less corruption than normal bureaucratic systems. Current existing systems massively reward high status, well-connected people.
Thank you. Let me go to Catherine Fletcher. I promised I'd come back on ARIA for your final question that was in your mind on that.
I'm grateful, Chair. Apologies, colleagues. I shall be brief. I will happily wear a badge that says I am a bit of a scientific weirdo. And I broadly accept the idea that we need a skunk works policy to get the fruits of the British genius and what we can come out with. But what that will imply is a failure rate.
Yes.
So could you give the British public an idea of what a good success rate looks like if this new ARIA body funds 100 projects?
Sure. So I think you're completely right. Everybody who's been involved in these sorts of things at a very high level has said to me, essentially, If it isn't failing, then it's failing. It has to fail. And quite a large percentage of what it does should fail, shouldn't work. If that's not the case, then it isn't taking enough risks and it's not actually properly sampling from the design space that it should be sampling from. The Alan Kay, who's one of the old-timers, still alive in his 80s, who's written about the original ARPA and Park and created a lot of the technologies which now your phones and whatnot all use. His analogy is it's baseball. If you're batting 300, then that's fantastic. And that's the sort of approach.
Unfortunately, the British public is probably not as familiar with baseball as it should be. So just give us an out of 100. We can do cricket.
Well, if you applied that to 100 projects and you took the Alan Kay thing, then you'd say maybe a third of them are working out brilliantly and 2/3 of them aren't. But I think probably it's more extreme than that, right? If you look at venture capital now, which is actually an easier business than the business of what Licklider was doing or what General Groves was doing with Oppenheimer, almost all of their returns come from a tiny number of successes. Even the very best venture capital companies, half of what they do totally fails. A lot of what they do largely fails. And almost all their returns come from a tiny number of successes. And I think that's the sort of approach which ARIA needs to take. That's the whole point of having an institution like this. The crucial thing there is you learn from what's failing.
Yeah.
Is the institution
what
set up so you learn?
What you're almost saying is a success metric is the percentage of failures.
Certainly, it's one of them. Yes, that's what the people who've actually been part of a successful thing like this say to me.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We're going to move on to science funding more generally, but just on the ambitions that you've set out and that you have for ARIA. Is £800 million, which is a lot of money in the scheme of things, but is that adequate to the scale of ambition and purpose that you have in mind for this organisation?
I think it's not, but I think to begin with it's fine because this thing will take time to scale up. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the US DARPA, it's $3 billion a year. I think that if you're thinking about this over a kind of 10-year period, the way I would look at it is you kind of scale it up with a few $100 million. You watch what happens. And you have in the back of your mind the idea that it could get to the 3 to 5 billion a year type size in the future, but with one big caveat: it enormously depends whether or not you're going to use this organisation to try to do some specific missions, right? So, for example, if you took the example I gave earlier on, how do you stop something like COVID happening again? And you say, right, there is a set of challenges on a 5 to 10-year time scale around testing, sequencing, mRNA, vaccines, etc. You could easily sink. I think the current budget that some people are talking about in the States for that sort of thing is, say, 20 billion quid over 10 years. So it enormously depends whether or not you're going to give it some things like that. Are you, for example, going to ask it to look at some specific things around net zero, direct air carbon capture, things like that? Exactly. If you're saying, right, here's a pot of money, your job is to find people like Licklider, people like Darwin, people like Turing in their early 20s with ideas that could change civilization completely, then you don't need a huge multi-billion-pound budget for that. Quite the opposite. And I just stressed, the original funding that created the internet and personal computing was only a few $100 million over 15 years. Right? And that's created tens of trillions in value. So you don't need huge inputs in order to get the freedom is much more, for ARIA to succeed, the freedom is much, much, much more important than the amount of money. Spending large amounts of money the same as we're doing now, you'll just get the same things.
In terms of the critique you've given of the UK funding system with all of its bureaucracy and frustrations, is it a reasonable charge that you haven't been ambitious enough? You've concentrated on this ARPA, which is going to be a tiny proportion of the total, rather than using your time in office to get to grips with the main problem, which is the we hope, £22 billion of funding that you've just described goes through a system that is totally unfit for purpose.
Yep. So in 2020, I did spend a lot of time on this idea, but I spent far more time on the general problem. I think you're right. It obviously doesn't make sense just for us all to spend our time on creating one new agency, and then even if we get it right, the rest of the system is stuck in all the terrible ways it's currently stuck. So I completely agree with you. The good news is that I think that Ottilie Laser is both a brilliant scientist and really understands a lot of the bureaucratic problems. I think that there's a lot of brilliant officials in BEIS who understand what the problems are and were very supportive of me and others in Number 10 in trying to fix that. There is a lot of thinking about how this could be done. If I were you, I would definitely encourage this committee to say that Ottilie and Kwasi should be reporting regularly on the debureaucratisation of the overall system. The single biggest problem I think you'll have there is some senior people not at all fans of this. I think that's where probably your main problem will come.
Okay. What about in Number 10? This was, you said doubling the science budget was part of the deal that you did with the Prime Minister when you came in.
Yeah.
You're no longer there. Is there enough support for this in Number 10 to help Ottilie Laser and Phil Duffy in the Treasury pursue the debureaucratisation you described?
I don't know is the answer to that. I mean, I hope that as the country emerges from the current lockdown and as as there should be an urgent, very, very hard look by this building into what went wrong and why in 2020. One of the most obvious lessons of that is this problem. It's the incredible value potentially in getting science and technology stuff right. The disaster that can come if you don't get it right. But also, I would encourage people to think about. It's not coincidental that the vaccine program worked the way that it did. It's not coincidental that to do that we had to take it out of the Department of Health. We had to have it authorised very directly by the Prime Minister and say, strip away all the normal nonsense that we can see is holding back funding in the therapeutics.
We took it out of the Department of Health. Who was we?
Well, in the sense that Number 10 took it out of the Department of Health back in. So in spring 2020, you had a situation where Department for Health was just a smoking ruin in terms of procurement and PPE and all of that. You had serious problems with the funding bureaucracy for therapeutics on COVID. So that was the kind of context for it. Patrick Vallance then came to Number 10 and said, this shouldn't be run out of the Department for Health, we should create a separate task force. We also had the EU proposal, which looked like just an absolute guaranteed programme to fail debacle. And therefore Patrick Vallance, the Cabinet Secretary, me and some others said, obviously we should take this out of the Department for Health, obviously we should create a separate task force, and obviously we have to empower that task force directly with the authority of the Prime Minister. At that time as well, you had some very smart people saying, people like Bill Gates saying, don't do this in a normal way. Start building, like the Apollo program actually, exactly like that. Learn the lessons from that concurrency. So start building things like the supply chains and the manufacturing capability now, before you do, normally there's a kind of sequential thing, you figure things out, and then you do tests, and then you do manufacturing and distribution and everything else. What Bill Gates and a lot of other people said was just try and smash all of these different things together and try and do them in parallel. But to do that, you needed to have a different structure.
Well, we look forward to going into more detail in that as part of our lessons learned inquiry with the Joint Committee with Health and Social Care. On the science funding system as we have it, let me turn now to some of my colleagues, starting with Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming today, Dominic. So obviously you've already sort of focused on the fact that, you know, that there's a serious problem with bureaucratisation, and I love the word bureaucratisation. But how effectively do you think the R&D system that currently exists, including UKRI, is working in the UK? And what's actually working and what isn't working? Because we've already talked about this sort of very sort of vertical structure and having a much flatter structure for ARIA. What sort of key takeaways are there from what's already there about what doesn't work?
So you slightly sort of cut in and cut out there, I'm afraid. So I couldn't hear brilliantly what you said. I think what you're saying is kind of what's wrong with the current system around kind of university funding and UKRI and stuff like that. So essentially you have the output that everyone is looking for is pretty much identical, which is metrics like, is this going to be a paper, and is it going to be a paper in a high status journal like Science and Nature? The decisions are all basically made by peer review committees, and this forces decisions very, very much to conservative, cautious, incremental ideas. It's why I said earlier on that David Deutsch, one of our great physicist pioneers of the last 50 years, says he could not get funding now for his ideas from 1980 in the current system. And the people who approved this funding then say that there's no way that they will be able to do it now. So you have everyone's looking at these same metrics. You can't have software as an output. You can't have a tool like Arxiv as an output. You have the same kind of peer review committees looking at everything, and all of the different entities that you go to basically operate in exactly the same way. There's no one that you can go to and say, look, what I'm doing doesn't fit into that, into a standard metric. I'll give you an extreme example that I actually spent time trying to solve, right? So an extreme example of the kind of problem that you have, where it just doesn't make any sense, is that in pure maths, when I arrived in summer 2019, you're applying for pure maths, you had to fill out a thing called an impact assessment. Now, for anybody involved with pure maths, you'd know that this is just completely and utterly nonsensical. Like asking Turing to fill out an impact assessment in 1936 on his paper, it's just completely impossible. But in fact, the impact is, you create digital computers and you have Enigma and it's involved with beating the Nazis and everything else. But these sort of things are completely unpredictable in advance. It doesn't make sense to try and get these people to write these ludicrous forms. Now, it took me literally 18 months just to change that. And twice we were all told that it had been changed, and twice it somehow crept back into the system. Even after it's somehow deleted from the system, it then creeps back into the system. So dotted all the way through are these kind of completely crazy things that it's extremely difficult for the system itself to try and fix. And that pushes everything towards incremental improvements, extreme conservatism, give money to a lot of high-status men who already control powerful organisations. Don't give it to young people with new ideas. That I think is the heart of of much of the current problems.
Chris?
So would it be fair to say the issue is that there's far too much process and not enough emphasis on outcome?
Exactly. Everyone is emailing each other about these absurd processes for literally month after month after month after month after month. And no one has the authority to say stop. So,
just taking that to its logical extreme, would you say that basically we need a complete restart of the R&D process, an entirely new model, or is it a case that ARIA will sit alongside what's already there and possibly drive best practice?
I wouldn't say that you've got to just sort of completely tear up the existing system and start again. But what you do have to do is you have to have, if you're going to change this, you have to have senior people tasked with the authority to say, we are going to wage war on process. Because if you don't do that, then it just doesn't happen. And I spent a vast amount of my time last year. The media stories, I'm running around trying to have culture wars with the BBC and whatnot. In the real world, I was spending a huge amount of my time dealing with exactly this problem. But it's really important to understand that almost nobody, everyone has vetoes over everyone else in the system. almost nobody has the power to say, just stop doing this insanity. So last year, for example, when the Treasury tried to have this business case process for how pure maths should be funded, the whole system spent literally 8 months sending emails to each other, driving everybody insane. And then finally, I got the Treasury officials and some other people in a room and said, what on earth is everyone doing? And the Treasury was sheepish and said, yeah, well, we've made a terrible mistake on this. We should drop it. We're embarrassed. It goes. But it takes months and months and months of meetings and whatnot to do that. And that's even when you're sitting in the Prime Minister's office saying the Prime Minister wants this to happen. It's still incredibly hard, actually, in a practical way, to remove bureaucracy from the system. So you'll only get it if people like Ottoline and Kwasi are tasked with that by the Prime Minister and by the Chancellor, and then the Chancellor says to senior Treasury officials, no, we are actually deadly serious about this. We're not having a repeat of 2020. In all sorts of ways, the system is going to change.
So
Thank you, Chris.
Quickly off the back of that, obviously it's going to be a much smaller structure, which fine by me. But what safeguards do you envisage being built into that? Because at the moment, obviously, with layer and layer of bureaucracy, when these emails are pinging back and forth, somebody goes, that's a ridiculous idea, we're not doing that. If you've got somebody who has good taste in science, are they going to be the sole determinants of what goes ahead and what doesn't? Or is there going to be some sort of buffer built in there to say, actually, no, that is a good idea, or no, that's absolutely crackers?
So again, I slightly struggled on Zoom to hear what you're saying, but I think the answer to what you're saying is that a critical part of this. So if you go back to how Licklider got his funding in ARPA and how Bob Taylor got the funding to do the internet, both of them involved basically wandering into the director's office, having a chat, and the director saying, that sounds like a cracking idea, go and do it. That's the famous conversation with Robert Taylor in 67 or whatever it was on the ARPANET. The critical thing, if you're going to do things differently, is that individuals have to be able to place bets, not committees.
Okay.
As soon as you have committees and a pursuit of consensus, then automatically it's basically impossible to fund these sort of things.
Thank you very much, Chris. Is one way to deal with the bureaucracy, rather than it going through national organisations, to direct the money straight to universities for them to exercise at their discretion?
It can be, and it's definitely been a strength of ARPA and DARPA that they don't have a kind of empire building themselves. They don't build their own labs, and I would strongly recommend that ARIA itself does not build its own labs. It funds other people, so you avoid the empire building problem. However, it's also the case that in all my laborious investigations last year on this subject around the cabinet table, that universities themselves are also an absolutely massive source of bureaucracy. And one of the things that, in my opinion, that should happen is that the government should be very aggressive with universities and saying, we've got a lot of money to hand out, we're going to double the science budget, you've got to do your part. You've got to remove all the following nonsense from your maths department, from your physics department, from your engineering departments, if you want our cash. And create some really strong incentives on the universities, because at the moment the universities themselves add another layer to all of this process horror.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Carol Monaghan, but just in terms of the deal, doubling the science budget was part of the deal.
Yeah.
At the same time, the negotiation with the EU was going on, including our potential participation in the Horizon programme. Was it intended that the subscription to Horizon would be deducted from the science budget that was previously paid for as part of our EU subscription?
So it was over the 18 months from July 19 onwards, there was incredibly complicated discussions about the whole Horizon thing. My basic view of it was that if you can do that, I suggested, and David Frost tried to do this, going to the EU and saying, listen, let's just take all the science stuff off the table, separate from the main negotiations. We can all agree that this would be better for European civilization and the world if we can do a separate deal on science. Brussels wouldn't do that. They insisted on keeping science as part of the whole overall thing. So it got enmeshed in the whole process with Barnier. My essential view was that we had a moral obligation, and the Prime Minister committed to this, that Brexit would not take away a single penny of any existing funding.
Right.
That was my very strong view. It might be in the manifesto. I certainly tried to write it into the Conservative Party manifesto. I can't remember now. Maybe I'm going mad, I've forgotten. But I hope it's in the manifesto.
But that was your clear understanding of what the deal was?
Without any question.
Okay.
I mean, the Prime Minister definitely said a few times that we should, whatever happens in terms of the EU negotiations, British science will not lose a penny.
It doesn't come out.
We'll find the money to make that work, and that's obviously what should happen.
Okay. Same question on ODA funding. I don't know whether you were in number 10 when the discussions about having a temporary cut to ODA funding were taking place.
Yeah.
Some of that, quite a lot of that, funds science research. Was it intended that that should reduce the science budget?
Certainly not intended by me, no. I could see there was definitely a strong argument that the Chancellor made for making a temporary reduction in the ODA budget overall. My view was that because of how budgets are done, there's a natural tendency in Whitehall to try and double count things, to try and say, oh, well, if you put £1 in that pot, then it counts for ODA, and it counts for science, and it counts for this, and it counts for that. My view very strongly was that whatever we did, whether it's Horizon or ODA, shouldn't be subject to kind of to Whitehall accounting gimmicks.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to Carol Monaghan, then Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thanks very much, Chair. Dominic, I'm struggling to understand. You've given particular examples of difficulties with the existing funding system, and I'm struggling to understand why you consider the best way of tackling difficulties with how science is currently funded is by setting up a whole new different agency. Now, we're talking about really a small amount for this agency. 800 million is a small amount of the overall science budget. So surely we would be better actually dealing with the vast majority of science funding and how it's allocated within UKRI, rather than tinkering about with a small amount, probably less than 1% of what we have in order to set up a new agency. Could you maybe explain that?
So I thought obviously I wasn't clear before. I don't think at all that all of the focus should go on creating a new agency. I don't think it's either or. I think that there ought to be. I made huge efforts. I made more efforts last year to try and deal with the overall system than I did with trying to create a new agency. But it's not either or. I think we certainly have to make huge efforts to improve the basic system. The problems that we had last year dealing with COVID make the case extremely eloquently for why the overall general system must change. But you also can have a small niche entity which is free of all the existing rules and regulations as well. I don't think it's an either or. I think there is more than enough money to be able to do both. And again, I would stress what I already said. It doesn't need huge amounts of cash. The computing research in ARPA in the 60s and 70s was a few $100 million in today's money. So it doesn't need a huge amount of money. It's the freedom for people to act in a low friction way, which is really the critical thing.
Carol?
So you were very keen that science funding was increased significantly. What were the key threats that you considered were required this additional spend of money?
Well, I mean, if you go back and look at lots of things that I've been writing over the last 10 years, there's lots of things that I wrote about how there's tremendous opportunities to invest in science and technology to change the world for the better. But also we need to make this a core focus of the British state, because if we don't, it's incredibly dangerous. I mean, back in summer, I think June or something, 2019, only a month before I went into number 10, I wrote a long thing about science policy, about decision making, about expertise, about how the cabinet room would collapse in a serious crisis because of how it's set up, etc., etc. And if you don't take science and technology seriously, you don't have the kind of skills needed in the apex of power in the state, then it can be extremely dangerous. And you've got these dangers multiplying all the time. You've got dangers on pandemics, you've got dangers on engineered pandemics, you've got problems of the last 70 years. We still today have nuclear weapons on launch on warning, which is a massive, massive nightmare. So all of these, both in the positive sense of the value you can create and in the kind of defensive sense of the disasters you can avoid, I've been arguing for 10 years that science and technology should be seen as a core part of what the Prime Minister's job is. And in fact, the very last meeting I ever had, the last discussion I had with the Prime Minister the day that I left Downing Street was actually on this subject. Was about how to change the bureaucratic structures inside Number 10 in the Cabinet Office so that you make science and technology a core part, not just of the current Prime Minister's job, but all future Prime Ministers' jobs. And again, I think that, obviously I've been saying this for 10 years, I think that last year just makes it obvious.
Thank you. I don't think any of us in this committee would disagree with the importance of science and technology. The government has a target of 2.4% of GDP. Is this realistic?
I don't know. I don't know. I also don't think it's enough either. I think that as a country we should be aiming both for. So for me, the doubling was only was a first step. So I think doubling the science budget is a critical thing and a good thing. Improving how the general system works is alongside it is necessary so that money is not just wasted. In brackets, I'd point out, I think NIH doubled its budget in the States over the last 10, 20 years, but they didn't change how the money was spent, and therefore doubling it basically has had no impact. So changing it, changing how the money is spent is just as more important than increasing the budget. But I think long term, we should be looking at more than the current plan. I think we should be looking at having much longer term budgets. The other big problem inside UKRI, and one of the big differences between UKRI at the moment and the normal science funding process at the moment, and a great entity like the 60s ARPA or Bell Labs, is their inability to plan long term, which is incredibly damaging for science. So I think 2.4%, they should be aiming at that. The government should be doing its part of that. The government should be spending proportionately at least as much as the countries around the world that are doing the most on this. So places like Korea, China, etc. Instead of languishing at the bottom of the G7 or G20 lists, we should be aspiring to be at the top of those lists. But I stress, how the money is spent is even more important than just increasing the amount of money.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll now go to Rebecca Long-Bailey, but just to pick up on the point that you made to Carol about your last conversation with the Prime Minister was about moving the administration of science into the Cabinet Office. Presumably from Bayes, is that right?
Yes.
Conversations are two-way. Did the Prime Minister agree with that proposal?
Yes, there was a note that I wrote with Patrick Vallance, which I actually gave to the PM in my very last conversation with him and said, you should approve this. And he gave it back to the Private Secretary and said, approved. And so hopefully that is actually what's happening. So the Cabinet Secretary, Patrick Vallance, me, Ottoline, various people had a lot of discussions last year, obviously partly in a kind of learning lessons from COVID way, about how the centre of government thinks about science and technology, about this basic problem of how to coordinate across the whole system when you've got warring departments and multiple veto points and multiple bureaucracies kind of locked with each other and no one being able to break log jams. And that's why Patrick Vallance and I and the Cabinet Secretary said the current system is obviously no good and it should change very significantly. And the current Cabinet Secretary is a strong supporter for making science and technology core to the job of the Prime Minister for the future.
So the proposal is to bring it into the heart of government under number 10, and that's both a response to the learnings of the pandemic, but also to deal with the increased scale of investment in science that is now.
Yeah, because it's only with the best will in the world, the junior science minister at Bayes can't look across the whole system and have authority in terms of how Whitehall works. So you can have a theoretical conversation about what's the platonic ideal of how to do this, but that's not the situation that we were in last year. What I was looking at was what's practically sort of just about possible given how Whitehall currently operates and the whole departmental structure and whatnot. Unless you rip up really much more fundamental things about how Whitehall works, which personally I would be in favour of, you need a way for the centre to be able to look at, right, what are the big, so say, you've got things like net zero coming through, right? You've got huge net zero obligations and action. You've got huge defence and intelligence obligations. You've got the normal science budgets. You've got COVID response. You've got all these sorts of things. The current system has had no way to coordinate thinking about all of this, to think what are the real priorities, and then actually project manage them through the system, right, and drive it through Whitehall. That can't be done by junior Bayes ministers. It could only be done if you have in the current system. Actually, it's extraordinarily hard even for the Prime Minister's office to get anything done like this, as last year showed. But it certainly has no chance of happening unless it has the authority of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Rebecca Long-Bailey, then Mark Logan.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Dominic, for coming to speak to us today. I think you've been very diplomatic on government funding so far, and the possibilities emanating from an ARPA-style body could be immense, but the initial £800 million for ARIA, which incidentally has been pushed back now till 2024-25, it wasn't a vast amount of money when you compare it to the nearly $3 billion the US spends on DARPA, as you've mentioned earlier. But on the budget itself this year, there was no additional funding announced for ARIA in there, and further announcements on science funding were also scarce. Indeed, the Treasury hasn't made any funding available to support the UK's association to Horizon, which will need to be met from existing science budgets. And the ODA allocation to UKRI is reduced significantly, leading to £120 million worth of shortfall. So what did you make of the budget in relation to R&D? Do you think the government's being ambitious enough, or do you feel that they're at risk of watering down your ambitions? Certainly on the ODA and Horizon point, they seem to be doing the opposite of what you'd like to see based on your comments today.
So I didn't watch the budget, and I don't really have any idea what was in it. I'll take obviously what you say as fact. If the UKRI budgets have been cut, then that's obviously extremely bad decision. I don't know why that would have happened. In the budgets that I had, in the documents that I had with the numbers penciled in when I left in November, UKRI was getting very generous improvements to its core budgets, not just for this year, but throughout the next, through the whole spending review period and through till 2025. So if that's changed in the last 12 weeks, then that's obviously bad. And if there's dodgy accountancy tricks with ODA and whatnot, then I agree with you, that's also obviously bad. I mean, if 2020 isn't enough of a galvanising shock to say we ought to take science and technology seriously and both fund it properly and embed it in government decision-making intelligently and strip out the bureaucracy that causes so much harm, then I don't know what would be.
Rebecca?
Thanks, Dominic. Well, you didn't need to watch the budget. You didn't really miss much when it comes to science and R&D. But it's interesting, really, that the government has said that it was committed to making the UK a global science superpower, and that its R&D funding plans would help accelerate our ambition to reach 2.4% of GDP as spent on R&D by 2027. However, with the recent budget and the scarcity of increased funding for science, there's a real worry that the 2.4% figure, which I agree with you isn't big enough anyway, it could simply be met really by the collapse in Britain's GDP since the pandemic started, rather than a real terms increase in funding. So my question to you is, do you think that the government's intentions are to rely on meeting its 2.4% target through falling GDP? And what would you like to see the government do going forward in terms of real R&D funding? And you've said that 2.4% isn't enough, I agree. What percentage of GDP should we be spending on R&D?
So as I said, I stress I don't know what decisions were made after I left, and I don't know what was in the budget. I know that Rishi himself was always a very strong supporter of R&D spending in arguments between Number 10, the Cabinet Office, the Treasury, in different parts of Whitehall over the 9 months or whatever that he was Chancellor. Rishi always said that the two big things that he wanted to prioritise were science and technology spending and the skills agenda, the Alison Wolf skills agenda, to try and solve that century-long problem. So I think he personally is definitely committed to it. Personally, I wouldn't focus so much at the moment. Obviously, the GDP numbers are bouncing around all over the shop because of last year. I don't think that that's really the target to aim for. I would look at what the absolute numbers are. I think it would be completely crazy to say, okay, well, GDP has taken this huge hit from COVID. Therefore, 2.4% of it is much less. Therefore, we can cut science spending, but still somehow say that we're meeting the target. That would just be completely insane. What we should be doing is looking at the real terms budgets and increasing them up to the 22 that was originally envisaged and committed to back in March. Where it should go in the future, I think thousands of people will have a much better idea than me about what that should look like. But it's obvious that places like China and Korea are taking science and technology much more seriously than Britain has done over the last 10 years. It's obvious that David Cameron and George Osborne did not take this remotely as seriously as they should have done. They didn't fund it as seriously as they should have done, and we've paid a price in all sorts of ways for their, in my opinion, terrible decisions. We should be now you've got a situation where both China is saying we're going to spend huge amounts of vast amounts of money over the next 20 years, particularly in things like AI. The Biden administration is reversing Trump's trajectory and is saying that it's going to spend a huge amount of money as well. So I think there is going to be a lot of pressure on Britain. There'll be pressure on where great talent will go. To some extent, British science benefited from Trump in that people were looking to get out of that system and didn't have confidence in it long term. So some people came over here from the States. Now with what Biden's doing, the opposite sort of gravitational pull could potentially come into effect. So I think Britain can't match, obviously, pound for pound what China's spending and what America's spending. But I go back to my chart earlier on. Almost all of what they're spending is in this red circle. If Britain decides to do things differently, then it could have very dramatic improvements. And this is not a theory. This is not my theory. This is demonstrated historically. We know that if you do it differently, you can capture these great returns. So we should be looking to spend proportionally at least as much money as the countries that are most aggressive about this on the face of the planet. But we should also be more aggressive than them in terms of attacking bureaucracy and in terms of trying new ideas.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we go to Mark Logan now, please?
Dominic, and thank you very much for coming in this morning. My questions are quite broad and linked to what Becky has just asked. So we've had the integrated review yesterday. Our aim is to secure our status as a science and tech superpower by 2030. I mean, currently, do you feel that we are an S&T superpower? And how will ARIA and the integrated review help us cement that position?
I think It's obviously patchy, right? There are some fields in which we are a superpower. The first thing that comes to mind is what's happened recently with genetic sequencing of the COVID variants and things like that. We do have very, very strong life sciences, people like John Bell at Oxford. So there are areas where where British researchers are doing world-class stuff, but there's also, I was left in no doubt in my 18 months in government talking to these people that there is a feeling that we are falling behind overall globally. I think that's also the case. So we definitely have, there's great universities like Oxford and Cambridge, but I think increasingly the Nobel Prizes of the past are being used for branding, and we haven't invested over the last 20 years the way that we should have done to make sure that the pipeline of these things is continuing. And it's certainly the case that our best researchers are very worried about this. And they expressed this concern to me, and I was certainly very concerned about it. So we have got some brilliant things. We should reinforce those brilliant things. But I think the true situation is more worrying and dangerous than it appears. That's probably how I would summarise it.
Mark.
Dominic, just to come in on that, so I know you've mentioned East Asia and China, and I'm reminded of the sci-fi novelist Liu Cixin, who wrote Santi, or The Free Body Problem, and he kind of said, he was asked, where do you get all your great ideas for science fiction, and he said that, I realized by living in China that I was living in the future. Do you feel that we have anything to learn from China, or indeed any other countries in the region? And also, just recently, I know that the government has taken a different kind of step change on industrial strategy, and I'm just thinking to some of the stuff you were saying in terms of short-termism versus long-termism, and just keen on your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think that we do have huge amounts to learn from East Asia. I think that so after I was in the Department for Education 10 years ago, one of the things I wrote about that experience was how parochial it was as an institution, and how unwilling it was to look to learn, and in particular how unwilling it was to try and learn from East Asia. I think you saw exactly the same problem in Whitehall last year in a whole range of subjects. I think that what China and other countries are doing about making science and technology core to their policy. It's not a kind of, the way that Britain has sort of thought about it for the last 50 years, it's a kind of add-on. It's what the boffins do in white coats, but it's not really what serious politicians think about. It's not what the top mandarins in the cabinet office and whatnot think about. I think that mindset has been amazingly damaging for the country. It means that we haven't funded things properly, we haven't taken things seriously that we should have taken seriously. I hope that one of the lessons of 2020 is to change course from that. If you look at what the president of China is actually sits down for days on end with senior management around him, and has sessions on things like funding edge-of-the-art science and technology programs for the long term. And I think if we don't pay attention to that, then we will suffer enormously. Also, China and Russia have had extremely aggressive operations against this country to acquire British knowledge, both legally and illegally, overtly and covertly, because these countries take it deadly seriously. And Cameron Osborne did not take it deadly seriously, and in all sorts of ways they left the country open to and vulnerable. That's one of the many areas in which I think science and technology policy must change.
Thank you.
And we could definitely learn a lot from
Just
East Asia.
briefly, sorry, Chair, just briefly, Dominic, on in the industrial strategy, what would be your views in terms of that buttressing our science and tech prowess?
Yeah, I think, well, so I think there's a critical distinction to make that the state should not be in the business of trying to figure out, is Bill Gates or Steve Jobs right? Should we support Microsoft or should we support Apple in terms of consumer products? I think an idea of going back to the future with industrial policy of that kind, I think would be a huge mistake. But I do think, and I spent in 2020 I spent far more time talking about industrial policy and the productivity challenges than I did on all political and communications things put together. I think that should become a core element of what Number 10's doing. And you have to think across the whole pipeline, from funding the kind of core basic pure research stuff through the applied research, missions, moonshots, that sort of stuff, through to the kind of overall productivity challenges, skills, planning law, high-skilled immigration, all of these things. I actually started, so while PMQs was going on, I used to run a set of, I didn't have anything to do with PMQs. I used to have a separate set of meetings called Project Speed for much of 2020, where we would get some of the great officials around Whitehall and pull them together from different departments to try and figure out how to do this sort of thing. I hope that that's still going on, and there was certainly a huge number of very productive ideas, and certainly Rishi was a great supporter of this and put the institutional weight of the Treasury behind doing it. So I hope that a lot of that work will come out over the next few months.
Thank you very much indeed. Graham Stringer had a supplementary question he wanted to ask before we conclude. Graham?
Thanks very much, Dominic. It's been a fascinating hour and a half. I suppose it's a bit of an open goal. About 90% of scientists voted to remain in the EU. One of the reasons they gave was that the EU sponsored cooperation between different scientific institutions and universities within the EU. It was my feeling in debate and talking to scientists that cooperation and hitting that metric became more important than the science in terms of those projects. I wonder if you agree.
Yes, I do, unsurprisingly. I mean, obviously in the referendum, one of the things that you and I argued very strongly was that it would be very dangerous to let the EU continue to regulate science and technology in this country, and that we should take back control of regulation over science, technology, procurement. And again, I would argue very strongly that 2020 was a proof that argument was correct. I could understand completely the view of many scientists that they wanted to maintain cooperation across European networks. I think that's obviously correct, but I think as things are being proved every day now, scientists can cooperate globally without having to be part of the nightmarish Brussels system, which has blown up so disastrously over vaccines. Just this week we've seen what happens when you have an anti-science, anti-entrepreneurial, anti-technology culture in Brussels married with its appalling bureaucracy in its insane decisions over warnings on the AstraZeneca vaccine. I think we are extremely well out of that system.
Thank you very much indeed. Just a couple of final ones from me. The integrated review was published yesterday. It has a very strong role for science. In fact, it's the first pillar to sustaining strategic advantage through science and technology. I think those of us on this committee would welcome that. Is there a danger, though, do you see, that it can fall into the double counting trap, that if you've got this target of 2.4%, £22 billion, that existing work, whether it's in the MOD or elsewhere, is declared to be science funding, and it doesn't come anywhere near boosting the overall budget for universities and research institutes.
Yes, so I think that it's great that science and technology is core to the plan for the future in defence and security and in terms of reforming the MOD. The Chief Scientific Advisor there, Angela, I work with a lot, is fantastic, and I think she will use that money incredibly well. There is obviously potentially a danger about double counting, accountancy gimmicks, but in the end, that responsibility is going to lie on number 10, how much they actually are going to prioritise science and technology in the future. As I stressed, Rishi was always extremely supportive of me in these arguments across Whitehall as Chancellor, so I'm sure that he hasn't changed his mind and he will continue to be very supportive. But yes, there is a danger. Also, of course, the MOD has a roughly £10 billion black hole in its budget because of decisions made with Cameron Osborne back in 2010 and 2015 reviews, which were disastrous. Part of the reason why we've had to put more money in the way that we have done is to try for the first time in probably 30 years to actually have honest accounting. So I think also the Cabinet Secretary did a brilliant job last year, the new Cabinet Secretary. I spent many hours with him around the Cabinet table and a small group of people from the MOD, in which they said themselves, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, we've actually got honest numbers on the table between the MOD, the Treasury, Number 10 and the Cabinet Office.
Okay.
And so there are proper figures. I know that there are proper figures on spreadsheets that exist. I hope that those are the figures that are actually being used and that the system doesn't slide back into its old ways.
Which leads me to my final question. You say you hope. It's clear that one of your ambitions and motivations was to make or reinforce Britain's position as a science superpower. You had the position in Number 10 to be able to do that. Did you consider whether it was necessary for you to leave, and do you regret the fact that you're no longer able to steer that personally?
No, I don't regret that. I think I made the right decision to resign when I did. I actually said to the Prime Minister back in July that I would leave by Friday the 18th of December at the latest. So it wasn't, the whole thing was not exactly as it appeared. But as I said earlier on, I'll be very happy to come back and answer any and all questions about how Number 10 works, why I left, all the different things, crazy stories that have been in the media. I'd be happy to clarify all of those whenever you guys want me to come back and talk about that.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think we've covered a lot of ground today on ARIA specifically and science funding, the structure of science funding, which was the subject of the committee's inquiry. And we're very grateful for your evidence on that, which will help inform the debate and scrutiny in the House of Commons as we consider the bill to establish ARIA. We have, as you say, a joint inquiry into the lessons that we can learn and apply from the handling of the pandemic, joint with the Health and Social Care Committee. So we look forward to seeing you back to answer some more questions on those subjects at that time. Thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. That concludes this segment of the hearing. We're going to suspend briefly to invite the Secretary of State to join us.
Thank
Order.
You very much.
Order.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone's on this committee's time and attention and effort that you've made to try and help the science and technology agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Order, order.
Currently suspended. The proceeding is 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 currently suspended.
Order, order. The committee is back in session. We're continuing our questions about science policy, science funding, and in particular the new ARIA research agency. Very pleased to welcome, for their, I think both their first appearances before this committee, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Kwasi Kwarteng, and Joe Shanmugalingam, who is the Director General responsible for science at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Just to start with some questions about science policy and science funding. Does the government stand by the commitment made in the manifesto, in Queen's speeches and other fora, to the 2.4% target for R&D spending by 2027 and £22 billion of science, public funding for science by 2024-25?
Absolutely. We remain totally committed to those targets,
Very good.
Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
You. Excellent. And in terms of deploying that and making sure that the institutions have the money to spend, has the budget for UKRI, which is the main research funding organisation, has it been set yet for the next financial year?
It's still being discussed with Treasury and also with BEIS. There are a number of pressures, as you'll appreciate, on the budget, given where we are with COVID, and we're still in those negotiations and that conversation.
But it's 2 weeks till the beginning of the next financial year.
I'm fully conscious of when the next financial year starts, Mr. Clark, and we're very keen to get some sort of resolution pretty soon.
You picked up the portfolio, we know, in January, and there's a lot to do, as you say, for the reasons that you say. But you will understand that for an agency that makes long-term commitments, right, not to know its budget 2 weeks before the financial year starts is not happy.
It's very difficult, but you'll also appreciate that after £407 billion have been committed to the economy over the course of the last year, this is an unprecedented pressure on budgets, and we're in the process of trying to get a good settlement for UKRI.
So when do you think those conclusion? When do you think those conversations will conclude?
Well, it'll certainly be before the start of the next financial year.
All right, so in the next couple of weeks.
Absolutely.
Okay, and just give us a bit of background as to what is the reason for the delay? Is it because of money being spent on other things, or are there other?
I mean, you will appreciate there's a whole range of things that we've tried to button down. There's the horizon issue, which I'm sure you'll revert back to in your questioning. There's a whole range of issues relating to the COVID situation, the pandemic, which was announced in the budget, and that will have an impact on public finances. And also we're introducing the ARIA bill, which is separate, as I'm sure Mr. Cummings pointed out. But that's part of a wider discussion as well.
Understand. Okay. Let me go to Dawn Butler.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State. We just heard from Dominic Cummings, and I just want to talk a little bit about UKRI. It was formed in 2018, and it's barely kind of gotten off the ground. It was kind of made clear that there is a problem with the process when it comes to funding science. I'm just wondering, is it wise to prioritise a new agency rather than making UKRI more flexible with a visionary, high-risk, high-payoff science division?
So I think Mr. Cummings made a good answer to that point. What ARIA is trying to do is fundamentally different from what UKRI is set to do. They're different types of organisation. Even though there's an overlap, they fundamentally do different things. ARIA is about agility, nimbleness, and also has a higher risk appetite, as Dominic Cummings suggested. UKRI is the main funding body of our academic research, and it does a great job. I think the Paul Nurse's review of 2015 really set out the vision for UKRI, and the whole point of it was that it had a cross research view. ARIA doesn't have that. ARIA is a different beast, and should be thought of in a totally different way.
I totally understand that, and I can, in some respects, see the need for ARIA. But what I'm saying is, in the bill, it doesn't seem to make any connection to UKRI, and that seems quite strange, in as it's our UK research, scientific research, fundamental.
I don't think it's strange at all. I mean, the bill. I've got the bill in front of me, and you will appreciate that a lot of this legislation has got to be as concise as possible. And I don't think it would make any sense in a standalone bill. It's a standalone independent entity. It wouldn't make any sense to refer to UKRI explicitly in the bill, which is designed to set up ARIA.
Okay, so ARIA is exempt from freedom of information requests, and it will be able to spend taxpayers' cash in any way that it likes. Do you think that may raise alarm bells for some people with the recent sort of PPE scandals?
I think you raise a fair point, but you've referred to the bill, and I'll refer back to it. If you look at the bill, the Schedule 1 of the bill has a number of subclauses which deal explicitly with the corporate governance arrangements of ARIA. I think they're very robust. I, as a Secretary of State, or my successor, will have to report to Parliament on ARIA. There is a duty on the part of ARIA to submit accounts. These will also be scrutinised by Parliament. So I reject any idea that this is somehow going to be outside the normal corporate governance structure. And I think there'll be a great deal of transparency and oversight.
Dawn, you can't see, but Jo Shanmugalingham was indicating that she wanted to say, I think, something about the relationship with UKRI.
Yeah, so I think so you're exactly right. We're sort of through the bill setting up this new research funding agency, and we'll come back more to the purposes of that. But absolutely, at the same time, we're continuing to support and develop UKRI. appointed an excellent new chief executive last summer. They've been doing great work since then on reducing bureaucracy of the funding system. And as we set out in the R&D roadmap last summer, we'll be shortly commencing an independent review of bureaucracy across the whole funding system, universities, research funding agencies and all the other actors, to absolutely make sure this is not just about concentrating on ARIA, it is absolutely about making sure we make the best of the whole funding system, of which UKRI will always be the sort of the critical engine and the sort of the core of the system.
Thank you. Dawn.
Thank you. Thank you. That does add clarity, because actually, in order for ARIA to exist, it needs to be outside of the bureaucracy. It needs to have the freedom, and so, but it does need to have some transparency around that. And my last question, please, Chair. If it's going to be scientists that are on the very edge, the cutting edge of scientific development, can the Secretary of State really is the right person to lead ARIA? I mean, how would the Secretary of State know exactly what's happening? Because this would be cutting edge technology that you really would need to be deep into it to understand it. And also, how would we be able to monitor if, say, ARIA was to do research around eugenics?
So look, there are two issues here. There's the actual leader of ARIA, which is independent. That's someone that we're going to be recruiting, and he or she, whoever it is, I'm sure will be an excellent leader of the organisation. And then there's, of course, the parliamentary and governance oversight, where the Secretary of State necessarily has a role, because he or she, after all, will be the person that will be summoned to committees like this to explain what ARIA is doing. So there are two issues. There's a governance role where the Secretary of State has a key role to play, but the Secretary of State will not be determining on a day-to-day basis what the missions of ARIA will be, nor will the Secretary of State be funneling money, if that's a way of describing it, to individual projects. There is a separation in terms of the operation of ARIA, which will be run by a director, and of course the governance and responsibility to the House of Commons and Parliament.
Thank you very much indeed, Dawn. Next is Carol Monaghan, then Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I'll ask questions about UKRI in just a second, but first of all, Secretary of State, how will the government ensure there's oversight to ensure that ARIA is fully representative of the devolved nations in terms of funding allocation?
I think you raise an excellent point, and obviously in setting up this new body, we want it to reflect the wide talent and geographical spread of the United Kingdom. So there's absolutely going to be, certainly from my point of view, a real interest in making sure that that is represented. Now, and I've referred to Schedule 1 of the bill, there are actually specific things where the Secretary of State is involved in appointing perhaps non-executive members of the board and governance. And that's an area, even though it's not expressed in the bill, where we can actually, I think, do a much better job than we have done traditionally in representing the full breadth and width of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, because that is a concern that is raised regularly with myself and others, is the spread of funding and how it is still concentrated in London and the South East. If I move on to spending review, the announcement of 14.6 billion for R&D for 2021-22 was welcome, but will this include the contribution for Horizon Europe, or will that be considered as a separate funding?
That is a subject of the conversations that I was referring to your chair. And I think we have further conversations, we have further debate, if you like, within government, but it'll be concluded very, very soon. Jo, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the very welcome decision to associate to Horizon Europe obviously happened after the spending review, so obviously therefore wasn't part of those spending allocations. And as the Secretary of State said, discussions continue about how our association to Horizon Europe is funded.
And I take it you will alert the committee whenever you find that information out, or when a decision's made?
Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely right that your committee gets very early sight of when things are decided, what's happening.
Thank you. And looking at Horizon Europe, Secretary of State, I understand that you're aware that that there have been moves to exclude associated members from certain quantum and space funding streams. What actions are you taking to ensure that these do remain within the funding model from Horizon?
We've tried very hard, and we still are trying to make sure that this funding is protected. I think, forgive me, I think that we will make some progress in this area, and I'm hopeful that we can essentially be members of Horizon on the basis that we've historically been.
Carol?
Apologies, sorry, Chair. Emily, the news that UKRI has had a reduction in ODA funding, which is a necessary part of global cooperation, and we're all very interested in global cooperation in the last year. UKRI have said this will lead to a £120 million gap between allocations and commitments. Is this also going to impact non-ODA funded work as well?
As I said, we've got to just wait and see where the negotiations come to. I think in terms of the ODA reductions, we've said these are very, very difficult decisions to make, but the Chancellor made a decision to reduce ODA commitment from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% to GDP. He made very explicitly the case that this was an exceptional policy, and that we would try and revert. We will revert to 0.7 as soon as the fiscal situation permits. And that was almost the exact words of that was printed yesterday in the integrated review, where we made a very clear commitment, I think it was on page 5, to getting back to 0.7% as soon as the fiscal situation allows.
I think the case that is causing concern is whenever the fiscal situation allows, I mean, that could be any time, really. And is there any move from UKRI, or will there be any move from government to replace the UKRI funding that has been lost as a result of this?
We remain absolutely committed, Ms Monaghan, to the 2.7% target that your chairman referred to, the 2.4% rather target that your chairman referred to by 2027. And we are absolutely committed to making sure that we spend enough to make sure that we are a science superpower. That remains a robust commitment, which I can reinforce today.
Thank you very much indeed. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, and thank you both for joining us today. Secretary, as you've heard, there's a confirmed 120 million shortfall for research funded from the ODA budget. Further, yesterday, following the integrated review, Universities UK, as I'm sure you'll be aware, wrote to government stating that universities are increasingly alarmed by reports that the Treasury has not made funding available to support the UK's association to Horizon. And they say that if this position is maintained, it will amount to an effective cut in excess of 1 billion, equivalent to the loss of over 18,000 full-time academic research posts. So are the cuts in ODA funding for science and the potential requirements for UKRI, I know you haven't stated what's going to happen yet, but those requirements for UKRI to fund Horizon from existing budgets really consistent with the government's aims to increase funding for research?
I think you make a fair point. I've said this a number of times. I think there is a huge pressure on public finances. We've got very ambitious commitments as far as the science superpower agenda is concerned. Yet today we're in very straitened circumstances. There's been a huge demand on the public finances. The Treasury has put in, as I said, £407 billion into the economy in the past year, and we've had to reduce the proportion of GDP that we put into ODA money, and that has an effect, clearly. But my job as Secretary of State is to try and make the case for science funding, and that's what I'm doing, and that's why, as your chairman suggested, we're engaged in ongoing negotiations within the government, ongoing talks within the government.
Thank you, Secretary. You've reaffirmed the 2.4% commitment of GDP on R&D, but there's a real possibility that the cuts that I've referred to could be masked by the 2.4% simply being met by a collapse in Britain's GDP since the pandemic started, rather than real terms increases in funding? So will you be altering this percentage to account for this fall in GDP?
So I think there are a lot of assumptions in your question. I mean, I don't think that the quantum of GDP will be lower in 2027 than it is today. I mean, that's predicting an appalling collapse of the economy. I think the economy will grow. In fact, the OBR in the budget suggested that the economy will be growing every year from now till 2027, and I expect that the 2.4% will be considerably more in real terms as well as nominal terms than it is today.
Thank you. And finally, Secretary, on medical research, there are a number of medical research charities that have warned of the significant impact of COVID-19 on their budgets for funding research. And responding to the budget recently, the Association for Medical Research Charities said that the government had chosen yet again not to provide any clear support for charity-funded medical research in the budget. So how does the government intend to support medical research going forward to address the shortfalls that charities are currently facing?
Again, I think that's a very fair point to raise. I'm very pleased. Actually, only last week I spoke to Michelle, I can't remember her surname actually, Michelle Mitchell, that's right, the Cancer Research UK woman. And Michelle was very clear with me that there has to be some sort of settlement. There has to be some degree to which the government is prepared to meet medical research charities and fund the difference. Now, obviously, that's a difficult conversation to have, but we're looking at ways, I'm engaging with her and her colleagues in other charities to make sure that we can actually provide the support that is under a lot of pressure, because as you know, a lot of their private donors, individuals who are very generous, have also been squeezed, and that's why we're in the difficult position we're in.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. We now turn to Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming today, Secretary of State. Later today, we're going to be debating both breaking up the Union and Brexit, so I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask about the Shared Prosperity Fund. Firstly, could you tell us when that's likely to be announced?
My understanding is that will be announced later this year. It's, as you know, been a subject of ongoing discussion. I certainly remember talking about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund when I was PPS to Philip Hammond when he was Chancellor. This is something that's been ongoing, but clearly once we have the deal, this is work that we can accelerate, and we hope, I think, at the end of this year, to have much greater clarity as to what the quantum of the fund and perhaps as to how it will be distributed.
Thank you. And will part of that fund be explicitly allocated for research and innovation?
I think the way the fund works will be very much specifically centred around place. So it'll be centred around the geographies of the UK. As far as I know, there hasn't been an explicit allocation to R&D, but clearly we've got to work out what the quantum of the fund is before we can actually put labels as to onto what the funding, which needs the funding will meet. I think that R&D is something which clearly is very close to what the government's trying to do. But I'm not sure that what the role of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund will be in that context. I'm sure Joe will be able to shed light on that.
Joe Shagabukuligam?
Yeah, so the spending review November last year set out the main strategic elements of the future UK SPF, and as the Secretary of State said, later this year an investment framework will be published, and the multi-year spending profiles we expect to be confirmed at the comprehensive spending review. We also have the UK Community Renewal Fund, which through its one-year pilots will help to inform. But I think absolutely we're very conscious of the role that the predecessor funds have played, combining with some of the national research funding we provide to support research and innovation in particular locations, and those are the discussions which will happen in government through the course of this year.
But I think the point, just to add in on that, I think Joe makes a very good point, but the point is that the R&D offer has actually come through previous funds as well. So how the UK SPF fits into that is still, I think, a matter of discussion.
Thank you. Just very quickly picking up on that, because Joe mentioned multi-year settlements. Will there be a provision for long-term funding, like the EU structural investments funds previously did?
Do you want to come in on that?
I think that's something that the Treasury, I'm sure, will be considering as part of the comprehensive spending review. I don't think we can speak for them here today, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll turn to talk about ARIA and some of the questions around the bill, if we may.
Yeah.
But just to kind of reflect on what we've heard so far on science funding, I may be wrong, but I get the impression that the discussions are continuing. There's a difficult fiscal settlement, and the fact that they're continuing suggests to me that you're in a series of conversations and you're advocating for this. Would you accept that, given the commitment that you've reiterated to a doubling of the science budget and to an overall investment in R&D that is to reach 2.4% by 2027, it would be paradoxical and regrettable if there were to be a shrinkage in the science budget in the next couple of years. Is that
yes, I mean, look, as far as I'm concerned, as Secretary of State for Bays, I want us to honour our commitments and lead the way as a science superpower. You will appreciate from your days as, I believe, you were Financial Secretary to the Treasury, so you know what the process is like. There's a huge amount of debate. People will debate how you define the spending, how you define the R&D spending, and that's something which within government, all governments, in fact, have always had these discussions between different departments. But the broad commitment remains the same, and as Secretary of State, I see a key part of my job is to make sure that we hit those targets.
Fantastic. And then in terms of the short term as well as the long term, okay, can I just confirm, which I anticipate is the case, that you're aware of the consequence, what would be bad consequences for things like, take the Faraday Institution that was established to develop cutting-edge technology in batteries, and we know that's going to be important in the future. Because its funding is not confirmed, then it's going to have to start to wind down its activities just at the point when we need to expand them. So, as an example of something for which a delay would have severe consequences, are you batting for them?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm completely aware of the risks, the liabilities, if you like, in terms of our funding situation. There are a number of great projects. I mean, you mentioned the Faraday Challenge, the Faraday Institute. That's a great project, and clearly, if we're in a world where we're cash constrained, we're budget constrained, a lot of great projects may be exposed, and our job is to protect them and make sure that the actual quantum, the rate of change, as it were, the increase, is sufficient to make sure that these things thrive and grow, and that's part of my job.
And in the same vein, and it's not to lay it at your feet personally, because as you've made it very clear, there's a conversation across government about this. But on the ODA and whether that is made up, I mean, UKRI have had to this week make an announcement that there's a £120 million gap between allocations and commitments. So these are projects that have already been passed, they've been scrutinised, approved, and found to be good value for money and impactful. And UKRI, government agency or arm's length agency, has said it's unavoidable that some grants will need to be terminated. That again, can I take it that you're battling to avoid that having to be put into effect? That's what they want.
We're always making these cases, representing as passionately and as energetically as we can the interests of our science base. But there is a wider context here. We're committed to trying to reduce by £5 billion the ODA spend, and that will have consequences. But this is in the context of an unprecedented fiscal situation. You will remember from your Treasury days, there wasn't a single time in those years where we were spending £407 billion, as we have done, to keep the economy going. It means there were very, very difficult choices. I think the Prime Minister, the Government, the Chancellor have had the courage to make those choices, but some of them have had impact. And I think in bits of our research spending, particularly with the ODA money, there have been difficult choices that have been made.
And finally, before I turn to Graham Stringer on ARIA. I don't know whether you heard any of the evidence from Dominic Cummings.
Heard it in patches.
You heard it in patches. Well, he was making the case that support from number 10, the centre, number 10 in the Treasury, was very important to advance your ambitions, and he was very complimentary about officials in Bays in this regard. Do you have the same level of enthusiasm and commitment in number 10? Perhaps this is one for Jo, since she's there. And in terms of perhaps I could talk about the circumstances of your appointment. Was this something on the Prime Minister's mind? Did he emphasise the importance of science and delivering?
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of my appointment, we can talk about that. I was Minister for Energy for 18 months. I was not an unknown quantity within Bays. And during that time, we launched, we had obviously, when you were Secretary of State, we passed the Net Zero Act, and we had the 10-point plan and the Energy White Paper. And what the Prime Minister expressly said to me is that Bays, you've come from within Bays, and we need to really up our game, not only on net zero, but we need to think about what we're doing in terms of innovation and other areas of the portfolio. I think within the first week that I was there, I essentially commissioned an innovation strategy, and I'm very delighted that Jo is the Director General that's driving that, and she's doing a great job. And the officials, as you will remember, within Bays are second to none across Whitehall, and it's a very, very good department to be Secretary of State for, as I'm sure you remember.
Absolutely.
But Jo would like maybe can fill in.
Yes, perhaps I don't want to put you in an invidious position because you obviously have to work with colleagues across Whitehall. But can I take it that you're still effectively engaged as a department with Number 10, even given the personnel changes that have happened there during your tenure, if not the Secretary of State's as Secretary of State?
So absolutely, the Prime Minister's, I think, personal commitment to science, innovation, technology is completely clear to everyone in government. You see it yesterday in the launch of the integrated review and the sort of how central science and technology is to that. So we continue to work really closely with Number 10, and we absolutely feel their support loud and clear for what we're trying to do in the department.
Are you part of these discussions that Dominic Cummings mentioned that the Prime Minister had approved to create in the centre, in the Cabinet Office, a strong science cross-government team and capability?
So the Secretary of State is the Secretary of State for Science and Innovation. That is very clear. Absolutely. We're always working with our colleagues across Whitehall about how we make sure we deliver on the integrated review and the role that the Cabinet Office can play in bringing together all of the bits of government. Because in Bays, we're responsible for the science system, as you know, and particular elements, fusion research, net zero, but you know what the MOD do, what DHSC do, and all other departments is really important. And the Cabinet Office have got a really strong role in bringing it all together to be more than the sum of its parts.
Indeed, and Mr Cummings said that because of that, because it's spread across Whitehall, the Prime Minister had commissioned the Cabinet Secretary to create this Cabinet Office team. Is that underway? Is that being created?
So I'm not going to speak for the Prime Minister and what his plans are there. You know, we always look at how we best make sure we deliver the Prime Minister's ambitions, and they're really clear on science and technology.
And particularly on that, I mean, I was very clear with the Prime Minister that I wanted Bays to take a lead in terms of science policy, and that's why I immediately commissioned the innovation strategy, which Jo is leading. That was within my first week as Secretary of State. And also I said explicitly that we would own the space strategy. I mean, if you look at the space and policy around space, that was sitting in lots of different buckets. Number 10 obviously had a clear interest in it, as did the UK Space Agency, other departments, the MOD and others. And I've said that Bays will really take the lead on this, and we're holding the pen on the space strategy, and we're very keen and excited about delivering that in the next few months. And I'm sure your committee will be very interested in that work.
Great. So you're going to be a muscular force in promoting and indeed defending the science and related policy and budgets.
Yeah, it'll be a very energetic approach that we take to this.
Thank you. Let's go into a bit more detail on ARIA, starting with Graham Stringer and then Aaron Bell.
Morning, Secretary of State. Good to see you. Just a couple of questions in detail on the bill. You say you've got it in front of you.
Absolutely.
If you look at clause 2, 6, A, B, and C.
Yeah.
Can you tell the committee why there isn't while there's a section on the economy, innovation, improving quality of life, there is nothing specifically on defence?
I mean, you could point to lots of different. It's quite a short bill. It's a succinct bill, and of course, as you know from your parliamentary experience, what we didn't want to have was what is often called a Christmas tree type bill. We didn't want to capture life, the universe, and everything on the face of the bill. You will also know, given your governmental experience and parliamentary experience, that the MOD has a specific interest in defence, and we're not trying, contrary to common belief, to recreate DARPA, which again, as you know, is the US defence sort of research agency. ARIA is something very different. I'm sure Dominic Cummings would have mentioned that, and he would say that ARIA's inspiration was really the ARPA of the 1960s, which wasn't as defence focused.
He did say that.
As DARPA, and I think this is reflected on the face of the bill, as you've mentioned.
Graham?
In terms of the really difficult balance in accounting for the expenditure of public money and giving scientists the freedom to innovate and think the unthinkable, I was slightly disappointed when I read the bill, because if you read Schedule 1, it effectively gives you, as Secretary of State or the government, the ability to completely take control. And even if you don't use it, that is hanging over the organisation at any time. Do you think you've got the balance right, Secretary of State, in giving the necessary freedom to this body?
I think you're absolutely right that there is a difficult and delicate balance to strike between parliamentary oversight and some degree of control, which oversight implies, and the intellectual freedom that is so necessary to making a success of this kind of institution. And Dominic Cummings spoke very eloquently, as I saw, about the intellectual freedom, the invention, the creativity that's required. But as a parliamentarian, you will appreciate, and certainly I do as Secretary of State, that this organisation does have to have some degree of parliamentary oversight. I think Schedule 1, which you refer to and I've referred to in my answers, outlines very clear clauses which allow the Secretary of State to intervene should he or she have to, but also, I think, permits the organisation with its non-executive members of the board and its executive members of the board and its director to have a degree of independence. I think there is a good balance that's been struck in the bill.
Dominic Cummings talked about debureaucratising science, and the sort of latest, the largest example he gave was comparing the excellent development of a vaccine and the distribution of the vaccine, which is absolutely world-class and first-rate, with the procurement of PPE and the rollout of test and trace and isolate. Have you learnt any lessons from the comparison between those two projects that you can apply to ARIA or science in general?
I think we've all learnt a huge amount from the experience of the last year. What I want to use the opportunity now is to say that the vaccine rollout was an extraordinary thing that happened. I mean, if we just reflect on what happened, and I think we should, within a year, we essentially found this appalling illness, this appalling virus. Our scientists managed to work out how to vaccinate people. We got the vaccine, we produced the vaccine, and we distributed it to the extent of millions. I think today it's something like 25 million of our people have been vaccinated. And all of this happened within 12 months. I think it's an extraordinary story, and I think we can't dwell enough on it. In terms of other areas, I think lessons have been learned, and I'm sure Dominic Cummings has expressed himself on that. I think the Prime Minister and people within the government have talked about, trying to learn the lessons. There may well be an inquiry that will take place after we've come out of this process, and clearly there's a lot that we've learned. But I think the vaccine rollout, the bit that BEIS was involved with, and I'm very pleased and flattered that Dominic Cummings acknowledged this department's role in that. The part that we played, I thought, was exemplary.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Just on the vaccine triumph, such as it's been, and a real fantastic example of science, the NHS, government, funding bodies working together. Clearly something to be emulated. You know that Sir Jeremy Farrar is the director of the Wellcome Foundation, one of the principal charitable funders. He's expressed himself concerned. He's been part of. He's a member of SAGE. He's been part of all of these discussions. He said that, as things stand, the National Institute for Health Research faces a funding cut for global health funding, obviously crucial to just what we've been talking about, of 28%. Is that something? This goes back to what we were talking about.
Yes, it does.
Is that something you've raised with the Prime Minister? The imperative of getting this sorted out.
I have raised with the Prime Minister a number of times the fact that we've got to do. We've got to do two things. On the one hand, we're talking the talk of science superpower, which is great, but fundamentally we also have to walk the walk,
exactly.
and that's something that I remind the Prime Minister about constantly.
Fantastic, Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Secretary.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to ask you some sort of fairly basic logistics about the setting up of ARIA, but if I could briefly, before I do that, just touch on your Radio 4 comments this morning about the Cumbria coal mine, in which you said you were sympathetic to what the Climate Change Committee said about the negative impression it was possibly causing. Obviously, climate change is a global problem, which is why we're having COP26. Surely the rational and scientific thing to do is to consider the world ecosystem and emissions globally in any decisions we make about this. And can you confirm that that's what your department and anyone will do?
I mean, all I was saying in the interview was that as Secretary of State for BEIS, I work extremely closely with the Committee for Climate Change. And my views are very much aligned in most instances with theirs. You will appreciate that this is something which is going through a legal process. And I'm not going to get drawn into the whys and wherefores and the particulars of that particular case. But generally, as Secretary of State for BEIS, one of whose key priorities is the net zero priority, which I'm very pleased to say that Mr. Clark actually drove through as Secretary of State, and we take that very, very seriously. And as a consequence of that, I am very much closely aligned with the Committee on Climate Change.
Understood. But I think the concern would be that we're not doing things that offshore our emissions, and in fact might increase total global emissions at the expense of making ourselves look good.
I think that's true, but also I think one of the things we announced today, and I'm sure you picked that up in the interview, was of course the decarbonisation of industry, and that's clearly the prize that we are focused on. And if we can actually achieve that, we won't need to be able to. We won't need coking coal in the UK because we won't be using that technology. Clearly a long way, some way down the track, but that's the ultimate goal, and that's something I think we can achieve in 15 years.
Thank you. Turning to ARIA, when do you intend to begin recruiting for the chair and the CEO of ARIA? Will you be restricting the pool of candidates to scientists, or are you prepared to look beyond scientists?
We're not restricting the pool of any candidates, and we're going to be starting, I think, in the early summer, probably April, May, that sort of time.
And will the Chief Exec and the Chair be subject to pre-appointment hearings, presumably by this committee?
I don't think they will in the first instance, because they're not one of the institutions on the Order in Council which would require. But I think there's no reason why we can't reach an accommodation with the committee, once the institution is up and running.
Thank you.
Joe, do you want to come in on that? Sorry.
No, that's exactly right.
Yeah, so there's no official requirement for them to have them, but I think
because it's new. Well, it's new. So
yes, but I think it would be welcome if this committee was
once it's
engaged.
set up, then I'm sure we can find a way of accommodating the committee's insatiable curiosity.
And will ARIA exist in shadow form for a period first? And when will it be fully operational? Is there a specific date in 2022 we're looking at?
Yeah, so I think in terms of process, this is how I see it. I think we'll try and we'll launch a campaign, that's the phrase that we use, to find a director. I think we will have some officials as part of ARIA. And then in terms of the launch of the organisation, I imagine that it'll be sometime in 2022. But these dates can shift, as we all know.
Would there be a shadow phase before it's launched, or is it just?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by a shadow phase.
Yeah, sure. And obviously, it's subject to Parliament considering the legislation, so we have no organisation until Parliament's considered the legislation. But our hope and expectation is it's fully operational in 2022. Obviously, depending on the timing of the passage of legislation, we will then look at whether, and the appointment of the chair and chief exec, whether it makes sense to have some sort of shadow phase, as you say, as we did with UKRI, before we enact the provisions, if Parliament passes them, for ARIA to be sort of fully constituted.
It's obviously vital to get the right person. I know Catherine's going to ask about that.
Just on that point, Aaron, in terms of the kind of shadow organisation, my understanding, and perhaps Joe, you know better, is that you can establish, after second reading has been passed, a shadow organisation that is so you can get underway rather than waiting for the length of the parliamentary process. Is that the intention, to make use of that ability?
I think what we'll want to do first, as the Secretary of State says, is make sure we have identified the right chair, the right chief executive for this organisation. Sure. That is the priority alongside the passage of the legislation.
We've got to jump the fences as they come.
So you get on with that.
So once we've identified and hired and signed the deal, as it were, on a director, then the other elements can fall into place and we can deal with those problems as they arise.
Thank you.
I mean, as the committee's report rightly says, the culture of the organisation, the organisation structure is key. We need the chair and the chief executive to be directing that, setting that. I don't think it makes sense for us to get too far ahead until we've found those individuals who are going to shape this organisation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was sort of going to say that we obviously, the person is so important, or the people at the very top, and we wouldn't want to be in a situation where we miss out on somebody because of the process and the order that takes place. I think my time's nearly up, and I think Catherine Fletcher is going to follow up on.
All right, thank you very much. Catherine Fletcher.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Aaron. Listen, when we were talking to Dominic Cummings earlier, I was really keen to kind of understand how we don't make this impossible for any normal human being to do the job. The likes, the people that can spread a breadth from quantum mechanics to net zero technologies to the completely brand new that frankly nobody in this room is qualified to understand. That's a hell of an individual. What qualities do you want the ARIA leadership to have? Apart from being Superman or Superwoman?
No, I think the whole Superman and Superwoman thing is a red herring. I mean, obviously we want someone who's got the drive and the curiosity, and also actual organisational ability, because it will be a very unusual organisation. And I can tell you, Catherine, I think we've already had a lot of interest in ARIA, not just from countries who wish to reproduce it and are very interested in what we're doing, but also from individuals, as I understand, who are very interested in the potential, for actually heading and leading an organisation that's so innovative and unusual. I think there's a huge amount of interest. I'm very confident that we will, at the end of the campaign, hire someone with the requisite skills. I think, as I say, a passion for innovation, a flexibility of mind, energy, all of these qualities. They don't have to know everything about everything, but I'm sure we can find someone who has the requisite skills to drive the project forward.
And to culture, because you mentioned leadership, and ultimately any system that's relying on people, it's about culture and leadership at the end of it. Are you going to hire someone that is going to create a skunk works, off-the-wall collaborative culture, or are you looking for someone that is capable of effectively administering others to do that in the CEO chair roles?
I think there's no reason why people can't do a bit of both. I mean, there are lots of examples. I mean, I've been very lucky in my current role in this job to speak to people like Demis Hassabis. And he's a great innovator. He's someone who essentially headed up DeepMind. And he's someone who has got people skills, he has got leadership qualities, but also he's an innovative and creative thinker. There are lots of people out there who really have an appetite to do this kind of work. And I'm very hopeful that we can recruit someone in that mould.
Fair enough. Thank you, Secretary of State. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Did you want to add anything to that, Jo?
Well, just to say, obviously, I mean, it's a great question. We're making different appointments here. So we're appointing the chair and we'll be appointing the non-executives in future, and then we appoint the first CEO. We'll want different skills in those people, particularly the chief executive and the chair. Right. And one of the balances we've tried to strike in the legislation and Schedule 1, which we've talked about, is as well as giving ARPA the operational freedom it absolutely needs, is sort of good governance, that there is a board with a majority of non-execs, accounts, an annual report which will be laid before Parliament, and so therefore the skills of the person to lead the board will be different to the skills of the chief executive, who's going to really drive and create the culture and identify and lead the programme managers, which is where the sort of domain specific expertise will really be vital.
Sorry, Chair, just one very brief follow-up. What Dominic Cummings was talking about was if it gets too close to conventional structures, it's going to fail. And just in listening to that with non-execs and permanent roles, that sounds quite like existing cultures. We heard lots from US DARPA about the fact that everybody has is temporary. They have an end date on their passes to make sure that they don't get too comfortable. Is that going to be part of this model?
So Catherine, you've identified the key problem that we've been talking about. We've got to balance, on the one hand, something that's new and innovative and creative and slightly wacky perhaps and unconventional, but on the other hand we've got to have corporate governance, and I'm responsible to people like you, frankly, in Parliament, as I should be, to justify the actions of this project, of this organisation. So we do have to have corporate governance structures which are very clearly outlined in Schedule 1 of the bill. But at the same time, we want to create something that's new and fresh and innovative. So it's a balance that I think Graham Stringer referred to. I think the balance is about right. But clearly, if I don't get it right, I will be up here answering questions in front of Mr. Clark and yourselves.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of final ones. Obviously, one of the big questions in our report and in what we've heard today and in the commentary since the bill was published was what the focus is going to be. Yeah. Take us into your confidence on that. Sure. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think that's a very fair question. I mean, if I were in your position, I would be asking, so what are the core missions of ARIA? I think that's a legitimate question. I think the point that Dominic Cummings made, or I'm sure would have made, is that that will be a job for the people who we hire, who are running the organisation. But just to give you a flavour, I'm very keen that we have an innovation strategy. In that innovation strategy, it'll be following up from your grand challenges. I'm sure we'll be refining those. That will provide what I call tramlines. Now, it'll be up to the head of ARPA to decide whether he or she thinks the organisation should adopt what the innovation strategy suggests, or adapt it, or reject it. That they will have independence. Yeah. But I think there is a role for government to stress or outline tramlines, as I call them, in terms of where we think the UK has comparative advantage, and what areas we want to see dynamic innovation in.
So you'll publish the innovation strategy, and the person or people running ARPA will consider that, and then it's up to them to decide. Or
I think ultimately it will be up to them, but that's something which I look forward to having that conversation when it's up and running.
I see. And finally, you probably heard some of the reflections, partly to do with the need for ARIA being a reflection on the levels of bureaucracy and delay in the current research structure. Now, you've inherited this. I mean, what are your first impressions? Does it conform to what Dominic Cummings was saying?
I mean, Dominic has his own particular take on things. I don't see UKRI as something which has been, mired in bureaucracy and red tape. I think that for what it is and what it does, it's very effective. But the way I look at it is that ARIA and UKRI are trying to do different things. Mm-hmm. So you can't judge them on the same criteria. They're different beasts, if you like. And what I would say is that UKRI, I think, does work effectively. I think as the main sort of channel of science and research funding in the UK, particularly in academia, it works very well. But one of the things that I've learned in my brief time as Secretary of State, talking to people like Stephen Chu, Nobel Prize winning laureates, and really amazing researchers and brilliant researchers, is that we need to have a diversity. You know, all the best researchers, all the most innovative thinkers in this space will say you have to have a diversity of institutions, as they do in the United States. And I think ARIA does give us always a step towards a greater diversity in terms of our approach to R&D.
The concern might be, and the committee, as you know, endorsed the proposal, but the concern might be that that is thought to kind of satisfy the appetite for reform when the great majority, over 95%, I think 98% of science funding will be through other organisations. And even in UKRI, people who've given evidence to the committee from UKRI, and including people who've led UKRI in the past, have been very critical about some of the bureaucracy that they feel that is imposed on them. Yeah. So do you have a reform agenda?
Yeah. I mean, as Jo mentioned earlier in her excellent answers, we are actually going down a review of bureaucracy precisely to try and cut away some of the red tape that people have complained about. All I was trying to say is that I think UKRI does a good job. I don't see it as the bureaucratic nightmare that others have portrayed. I think it has been effective. You just need to look at, as I said, the vaccine rollout. But that doesn't mean that bureaucracy isn't a problem. It doesn't mean that it's utterly perfect. And it doesn't mean that we can't do more to try and tackle bureaucracy. I mean, Jo, do you want to come in on the review?
So as we said, we'll be launching the review announced in the R&D roadmap to look at the whole system, because it is not just UKRI's role or other research funding agencies, it's how it interacts with what goes on in higher education institutes and other sort of places that research happen. I think the other thing I'd observe is UKRI is still a really young organisation, and Ottilie and Liza and I were giving evidence to the Public Accounts Committee a couple of weeks ago about the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, and exploring there, how UKRI is developing in its capability to business cases and set out the monitoring and evaluation of projects, so that we all rightly can evaluate the impact of the research that they fund, and therefore the public money that we're putting into it. So as UKRI matures as an organisation, so this all works more smoothly as well.
And when do you expect to conclude that review of bureaucracy?
I think it will. We're expecting it to conclude at the start of next year. These are system-wide issues. We want to look at them deeply and thoroughly. It's a sort of generational reform we hope to take through as a result of looking at the issues.
Excellent. Well, that I think concludes our questions today. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for your time. We've gained a lot of insights that will help, I hope, Parliament and both Houses of Parliament scrutinise the ARIA bill when it goes on the floor of the House and into committee. You've addressed some of the very live and urgent questions of science funding, and we've got a clear view as to your muscular intention on that. We wish you well, and we hope that you will be able to come back to the committee very soon with some positive news, in particular in the context of a very welcome rising science budget, that it would be totally counterproductive to find any shrinkage in that in the shorter term. Thank you very much indeed for your evidence today, and thank you for your first appearance in your role.
Thank you so much.
That concludes our hearing. Order.
Take care. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.